Chapter 1. There is a kind of invisible that has nothing to do with being unseen. Sable knew it the way she knew the smell of lye soap and the ache of a full ash bucket. Completely, without romance, and without any real hope that it would change. She was invisible the way a stone step is invisible. People walked over her every single day and never once stopped to think about what held them up. She was packless, shiftless. A girl with no wolf curled inside her chest, no amber fire behind her eyes when the full moon crested the Ashvale Mountains and called every soul in the territory to its knees. In a world where your worth was measured in the size of your beast and the thunder of your howl, Sable had precisely nothing to offer but 2 capable hands and the hard-earned wisdom to keep her head down. The Ironhold pack did not let her forget it. She lived in the underbelly of a castle that had forgotten how to breathe. Crestmore Keep sat at the northern edge of the territory like a cracked tooth, enormous, cold, and fundamentally broken since the night Lord Cain Aldric, the Iron Alpha, had been taken from it. Not killed, not exiled. Taken. Sealed inside a sorcery so old and so malicious that not one healer, not one shaman, not one desperate packmaster in 13 months had been able to so much as scratch it. He stood in the great war hall, exactly where he had been standing for those 13 months. Ice. From the soles of his boots to the crown of his dark head, he was encased in a shell of pale blue-white ice that never melted, never cracked, never wept a single drop even on the warmest days of the brief northern summer. The cold that radiated from him was not natural cold. It had a pulse, a consciousness, an intent. He was mid-stride, one fist raised, his face locked into an expression of savage and terrible wrath. 6 feet 4 inches of the most feared alpha on the continent, sealed inside a glacier like a weapon someone had decided to put away until it was needed. Sable swept the floors around his feet every morning. She was not supposed to linger. Lord Gregor, Cain's uncle and the man who had settled into the Iron Alpha's seat with the comfortable speed of someone who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity, had made his feelings about the war hall abundantly clear. It was a place of official mourning. A monument. Not a destination for packless servant girls with no business being anywhere near it. But Sable lingered anyway, in the thin stolen minutes between the dawn duties and the breakfast service, because the war hall was the only room in Crestmore Keep where no one struck her. Lord Gregor's steward, a brittle man named Peck, had a particular fondness for the back of his hand. The alpha warriors who ran the training yard had a particular fondness for using her as a lesson in consequences. And then there was Myra Voss, the daughter of Gregor's chief advisor, a woman who had appointed herself the moral authority of the Keep's entire household staff the moment Cain Aldric's eyes went still and blue. Myra was everything Sable was not. Tall, sharp-jawed, with a wolf so dominant that lesser omegas quietly stepped off the path when she walked down it. Her contempt for Sable was not casual. It was considered, carefully maintained. A craft she practiced with genuine dedication. It was a grey Tuesday when she found Sable still in the war hall 10 minutes past the end of her allotted window, still keeping vigil over the ice block. Myra's voice arrived before she did, sharp as a thrown blade down the stone corridor. She appeared in the doorway dressed in deep burgundy, her dark hair coiled at her neck with the precision of a woman who understood that appearance was a form of power. Her eyes found Sable on her knees with her brush and bucket, and the smile that crossed her lips was the particular smile of someone who has just been handed something delightful. Sable stood. It was always better to be standing. Being on your knees invited a different category of cruelty. The floor was chalked from the war council last night, she said, keeping her voice flat and her gaze at the neutral middle distance, not submissive enough to invite escalation, not direct enough to invite punishment. A calibration she had spent years perfecting. I was finishing. You were staring. Myra walked into the hall with the unhurried stride of a woman who had never once had to justify her own pace. She circled the frozen king the way she always did, proprietarily, as though his imprisonment had made him hers to manage. He cannot see you, little shadow. He cannot smell your sad, empty nonsense. He does not know you are alive. She stopped and tilted her head. Then again, neither does anyone else. Sable's knuckles tightened on her brush handle. She said nothing. Words earned her bruises. Silence earned her only this, the clean, cutting sting of a cruelty too precise to argue with. Lord Gregor is hosting the reclamation feast in 4 days, Myra continued, examining her own reflection in the glossy surface of the ice with visible satisfaction. 13 months since the Iron Alpha's incident. The Lord intends to use the occasion to formalize the seat transfer, make Crestmore officially his. She smoothed a strand of hair with 2 fingers. Every allied alpha, every noble house, every packmaster in 3 territories will attend. You will serve, floor staff, not table. Floor staff do not speak, do not meet eyes, and do not exist. If you embarrass this household, I will have you turned out before the first snow. She finally looked at Sable directly, with an expression of almost tender satisfaction. The first snow comes in 6 days. Do you understand what that means for something without a pack? Sable understood perfectly. Without shelter, without pack, she would freeze. Not metaphorically. I understand, she said. Myra's smile sharpened like a blade finding its edge. She left without another word, her footsteps a diminishing rhythm on the cold stone. Sable stood alone in the war hall. She turned to look at him. She did not know why she felt sorry for the Iron Alpha. She was not in a position to afford softness. Softness was a luxury, like warmth and full meals and the knowledge that tomorrow would be survivable. But standing in the grey morning light, looking at the fury locked permanently into his face, she felt a grief with no clean origin. He had not deserved this. Whatever he was, whatever capacity for hardness his strength had given him, no living thing deserved to be made into a monument. She reached out, she always told herself she wouldn't, and she always did, and pressed her bare fingertips against the surface of the ice. Cold, yes, bone-deep and immediate, but beneath it, a vibration. So faint it lived on the border of imagination. Less than a heartbeat, more than stillness. A single ember buried under a foot of grey ash that had not yet decided to go out. The mark on her collarbone began to burn. She pressed her palm over it through the fabric of her dress, her breath catching. It was a birthmark she had carried since before memory, a shape like a flame drawn in 3 strokes, small enough to cover with 2 fingers, sitting just below the hollow of her throat. Her mother had called it her hearthmark, had told her it was a remnant of something old, something that predated the wolves and the packs and the whole loud hierarchy of the world as it now stood. The hearthmark had never burned before. Not like this. Not with this urgency, this specific, insistent pulse, as though something deep inside her had just been asked a question it had been waiting its entire life to answer. She picked up her bucket. She left the war hall quickly. She told herself it was nothing. She almost believed it. Chapter 2. Sleep, when it finally came, brought no mercy with it. Sable dreamt of fire. Not the destroying kind. Not the fire that took rooftops and swallowed fields and left only black ground behind. This was building fire. Intentional fire. A hearth flame cupped in 2 careful hands and offered outward like a gift, steady and warm and unafraid of the dark surrounding it. In the dream she was the one holding it, and it did not burn her, and that fact felt more significant than anything she could name. Through the flames, a pair of eyes. Silver grey, the precise color of storm light on still water just before the rain arrives. Eyes she recognized without knowing how, because she had never seen them open. They existed behind 2 inches of enchanted ice in the war hall of a keep that had forgotten what warmth felt like. And yet here they were in her sleeping mind, open and blazing and fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel simultaneously enormous and very, very small. She woke before the keep bell struck the first hour. The servants' dormitory was dark and breathing around her. 7 other women on their pallets, all of them deeply asleep, all of them with the faint shimmer of wolf behind their closed eyes that Sable had spent years learning not to envy. She lay on her back and stared at the low stone ceiling and pressed her palm flat against her collarbone. The hearthmark was warm. Not the burning urgency of that morning in the war hall. Something steadier now, a low continuous hum, like a plucked string that had not yet finished resonating. She had never felt it behave this way before. In 22 years it had been nothing more than a mark, an oddity, a thing to keep covered, another reason for the world to find her strange. It had provided her with precisely 0 of the protection her mother had promised it represented. She thought about what Myra had said. He cannot smell your sad, empty nonsense. He does not know you are alive. She thought about the vibration beneath the ice. That single buried ember of a pulse. She thought, I should stay in this bed. I should count the hours until another grey morning of grey work in a grey keep, and I should be grateful for the roof and the pallet and the fact that today, at least, no one broke anything that mattered. She was in the war hall before the second bell. It was different in the deep dark before dawn. The ice glowed. That was the only word for it, a faint, sourceless luminescence, blue-white and cold and somehow alive, emanating from within the shell that encased him. The war hall had no torches lit at this hour. The only light in the room was him. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, her bare feet on the threshold, and simply looked. Then she noticed the cold was gone. Not the ambient cold of the northern keep in autumn. That remained, pressing through the stone floors into the soles of her feet. But the specific, radiating, unnatural cold that the ice always produced, the cold that kept the war hall several degrees below every other room in Crestmore, was absent. The air directly around the frozen king was warm. Not fire warm. Not hearth warm. The particular warmth of living skin, of a body that was still, against all evidence and all reason, generating heat. Her hearthmark was not burning. It was humming. A low, urgent resonance that she felt in her back teeth and behind her sternum, a frequency that seemed to be reaching towards something she could not see, vibrating in a register that her conscious mind could not fully interpret but that some older, quieter part of her understood completely. She walked toward him. Her feet carried her without the deliberate negotiation she usually required to approach him, the small internal argument between caution and that inexplicable pull. Tonight there was no argument. She crossed the war hall floor in a straight line, stopped at the base of the low stone dais, and looked up at his face. The fury in it was extraordinary. Whatever he had been in the precise moment the sorcery took him, he had been magnificent. His jaw was set like forged iron, the lines of his face all severity and hard angles, the tendons in his neck corded with the effort of a roar that had never escaped. His eyes were half open, caught mid-blink, arrested between one moment and the next, and the silver in them was visible even through the ice, even through 13 months of enchanted stillness. Blazing, furious, entirely, stubbornly, defiantly present. He is still in there, she thought. She had thought it before, every morning, but tonight it landed differently. Not as an observation, but as a certainty. He is still in there and he knows it, and he has not stopped fighting for a single moment of 13 months. A feeling moved through her chest that she did not have a precise name for. Sorrow and recognition, and something that frightened her with its warmth. She raised both hands. She placed one palm flat against the ice over his chest. She placed the other against the surface near his face, near the Loctite line of his jaw. The hum became a roar. The hearthmark blazed, not red, not orange, but white gold, a heat so concentrated and so complete that it should have been agony and was instead the precise opposite. A rightness so total it felt like the first clean breath after a long illness, like setting down a weight she had been carrying so long she had stopped noticing it. The light poured from her palms in visible streams, silver gold threads that sank into the ice and spread outward the way water spreads through cracked earth. The ice fractured. Not a slow thaw. Not a gentle loosening. A catastrophic, full-body fracture, a web of fissures racing outward from the points of her hands in every direction simultaneously, the sound enormous and grinding, a mountain deciding to become a valley. Steam erupted from the cracks in billowing white columns that smelled of pine resin and cold rain, and something else beneath both of those. Something electric. Something that bypassed the nose entirely and registered as pure sensation at the base of her skull. She stumbled back from the dais. The ice did not melt. It surrendered, collapsing inward, then outward, then simply ceasing to exist in great rolling clouds of steam that dissipated against the war hall ceiling and were gone. The blue-white glow became gold, then amber, then the warm grey of early morning, and then there was no glow at all. There was only a man. He drew a breath. The sound of it stopped her heart. Not the volume, the meaning. The first breath of a living thing that had gone 13 months without drawing one. His chest expanded with a violence that seemed to move the air in the entire room. His fists unclenched and clenched again. His feet, which had been lifted in mid-stride for over a year, found the stone floor of the dais with a weight that resonated through the soles of her feet from 10 feet away. The roar that had been locked in his face finally, freed itself. Not a sound. A pressure. A wave of pure alpha authority that rolled outward from him like a stone dropped in still water, hitting Sable in the sternum and driving her back 2 involuntary steps. Every instinct she had, the ones that had kept her alive and unbroken through 22 years of being the least powerful person in every room, screamed at her to run. Her feet did not move. His eyes opened fully. Silver grey. Storm light on still water. Exactly as she had dreamed them, except that no dream had come close to the reality of them. Alive, incandescently, terrifyingly alive, lit from within by something that was not entirely human and not entirely wolf and was not, in any interpretation, entirely safe. They swept the room. One single devastating arc, taking inventory with the speed and precision of a mind that had spent 13 months with nothing to do but think. The war hall. The doors. The windows, the exits, the time of day readable in the quality of darkness through the high narrow panes. Then they found her. He went still. A different stillness than the ice. A chosen stillness. The stillness of a creature at the absolute apex of every hierarchy that existed, who has just perceived something that requires every fraction of its attention. He inhaled. Long deliberate. His head tilted a single degree, a gesture so purely wolfish it sent a cold thread of recognition racing down her spine. Something moved through his expression. Something vast and uncontrolled that she could not name and could not look away from. Then, in a voice like a glacier deciding to move, deep, grinding, irresistible and just slightly terrifying, he said, "You." A pause. His silver eyes did not blink. "You freed me." Sable's mouth opened. The war hall was very large and very quiet, and her heart was very loud. She started. He stepped off the dais. Chapter 3. He moved the way avalanches moved. Not fast, precisely, inevitable. Each step off the dais was unhurried and absolute. The stride of a man who had never once in his life considered the possibility that something might not move out of his way. The stone floor seemed to recognize him. The room seemed to reorganize itself around his presence. And Sable stood exactly where she was because her legs had apparently reached a private agreement with the situation that did not include her input. He stopped 3 feet from her. Up close, the reality of him was staggering. She had cleaned around the ice for 13 months and understood intellectually that he was large, that he was physically formidable, that the stories about him were not exaggeration. Understanding it intellectually and standing inside the radius of him were 2 entirely different experiences. He was broad through the shoulder in a way that rearranged the available space. The lines of his face were severe and uncompromising. A jaw that could have been quarried, cheekbones that threw shadows, a mouth pressed into a line of such absolute authority that the concept of softness seemed to have never occurred to it. His eyes were fixed on her with an attention so complete it felt like being held. He inhaled again, slower this time, and something happened to his expression that she could not categorize. Not softening. The Iron Alpha did not soften, but a shift. The wartime calculus behind his eyes replaced, just fractionally, by something older and less governed. "What is your name?" he said. It was not a question. It was a thing he intended to know, and the distinction was audible. "Sable." Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. I work in the keep. I'm on the cleaning staff. I sweep the," she stopped. "I sweep the floors around your feet every morning" seemed like possibly the wrong thing to say. "I'm nobody. I don't know how I did that. I don't know what happened. My hands were on the ice and then it." "Sable." He said her name the way he'd said you, like a conclusion, like something he was filing away in a place he intended to access frequently. His gaze dropped to her collarbone, to the place where her hearthmark sat beneath the thin fabric of her dress, and his eyes sharpened with an recognition that made her want to step back. She held her ground. "You have the old mark," he said. "It's a birthmark," she said carefully. "It doesn't mean anything. My mother called it a hearthmark, but she said a lot of things that turned out to be. It means everything." The flatness of his certainty was more unsettling than argument would have been. He took one more step toward her and she held herself very still, the way she had learned to hold still around dominant wolves when the alternative was triggering a response she was not equipped to survive. "You are packless." Not a question. He had scented it. The familiar shame moved through her, well-worn as a river channel. "Yes." "And shiftless." "Yes." Something moved through his expression that was not pity and was not contempt. It was closer to fury, but directed, she realized with confusion, not at her but at the fact itself. As though her packlessness were a wound someone had inflicted rather than a condition she'd been born into. "You are not shiftless," he said. "You are something else." Before she could respond to that, before she could begin to assemble a reaction to that particular statement, his head snapped up. His body changed in an instant, the contemplative stillness replaced by something predatory and alert. He stepped forward and to the side simultaneously, a movement so fluid and so fast that she blinked and found him standing between her and the war hall doors, shielding her, with his body, without being asked and without apparent deliberation, as though it was simply the only logical place for him to be. "Someone is coming," he said. She heard them a moment later, footsteps, multiple sets, heavy and running, alerted by the sound of the ice fracturing. She felt the blood drain from her face. "The night guard," she breathed. "Gregor's men. If they find me here." They will not touch you, he said. The simplicity of it was almost offensive. He said it the way you stated whether. The war hall doors burst open. 6 guards in Gregor's iron-grey livery flooded in, swords already drawn, their faces cycling through confusion and shock and something very close to terror in the span of a single breath. They skidded to a stop on the stone floor. Stayed. At the empty dais. At the steam still dispersing toward the ceiling. At the man standing in the middle of the war hall who was absolutely, categorically, impossibly not made of ice anymore. The guard at the front, a broad, weathered man named Davin, who had served Crestmore Keep for 20 years and had the bearing of someone who had seen most things, went the color of old ash. His sword arm dropped. His mouth opened and produced no sound. Then, slowly, with the careful movements of a man who was not entirely sure his legs would cooperate, he went to one knee. His voice failed him. He swallowed. Tried again. My Lord Aldric. Davin. Cain's voice was controlled now, the glacier quality of it fully reasserted. Cold authority layered over whatever had been moving through him in the unguarded moments after waking. How long? 13 months, my lord. Davin's eyes were bright. The man was not, Sable realized, unaffected. He was simply too well trained to let it fully show. 13 months and 4 days. A muscle moved in Cain's jaw. My uncle. In his chambers, my lord. Asleep. Davin's gaze moved to Sable, standing behind the iron alpha, and something shifted in his expression. He took in the hearthmark's faint golden glow, still visible at her collar. He took in the way Lord Aldric was standing. The calculation on the older guard's face was swift and quiet and thorough. He suspects nothing. The sound. We told the others on the lower floors it was a structural shift. Ice in the outer walls, cracking with the cold. They believed it. Good. Cain turned his head slightly, not enough to take his eyes off the room, but enough to speak toward her. Sable, stay behind me. The words carried a weight that went beyond instruction, a thread of alpha command woven through them that bypassed her conscious mind and went straight to the part of her that was built from older materials than thought. Her body wanted to obey before her brain had finished processing the sentence. She found, to her own surprise, that she did not entirely resent it. Davin, Cain continued, secure this wing. No one enters the keep grounds without my direct order. Wake Oishan. He paused. Only Oishan. At once, my lord. The older guard rose, gestured sharply to the others, and they moved with the disciplined efficiency of men who had been waiting 13 months for someone to give them orders they actually believed in. Within seconds, the war hall held only the 3 of them, Cain, Sable, and Davin, who lingered with the air of a man who had something else to say. My lord, Davin said carefully. The reclamation feast. Lord Gregor has planned it for 4 days hence. Every alpha house, every. I know what a reclamation feast is, Cain said. Yes, my lord. I thought. Davin glanced again at Sable, and this time he did not look away as quickly. I thought you would want to know the timing. I want to know everything, Cain said. But not here. He turned to face Sable fully, and the full force of his attention arriving without warning was a physical experience, like stepping from a corridor into a room where a fire had been burning for hours. Come. She gestured vaguely at the war hall, the general concept of her life and its obligations and the fact that she was a floor staff servant with a schedule that Peck monitored with the vigilance of a man who had nothing else to live for. I have morning duties. If I'm not in the kitchen corridor before the... You will not be returning to the kitchen corridor, Cain said, with the same tone he might use to observe that water moved downhill. That is... She stopped, steadied herself. The fear was there, a cold presence at the back of her throat, but beneath it something steadier pushed upward. She had spent 22 years being told where she would and would not be, and she was, in this precise moment, very tired of it. With respect, my lord, you have been still for 13 months. You don't know me. You don't know what I am or what I can do or whether what just happened was something good. You can't simply. He looked at her. Not with impatience. Not with the specific contempt she had spent a lifetime collecting. He looked at her with an expression she had no reference point for, something intent and unguarded and entirely focused, as though she were the only point of information in the room that actually mattered. You freed me, he said quietly, when no shaman, no healer, no alpha in 3 territories could. You did it with your bare hands and a mark your mother gave you a name for and no explanation. A pause. And you came to the war hall every morning for 13 months. She opened her mouth, closed it. Davin told me, he said. Simply. He tells me everything eventually. He said the packless girl swept the floors around me every morning and always stayed longer than she was supposed to. He said she always put her hand on the ice before she left. The silver eyes held steady. Why? The question landed some way undefended. She thought about all the careful, practical answers she could give. Force of habit. Morbid curiosity. The war hall was warm in a way the rest of the keep wasn't. She thought about the version of the truth that would cost her the least. Then she thought about the ember beneath the ice, and the dream, and the way the hearthmark had burned every single morning when she pressed her hand to him, and she said, because you felt alone. The war hall was very quiet. Something moved through Cain Aldric's expression that she did not see clearly before he controlled it. Come, he said again, and this time the word was different. Not a command of authority. Something else. Something that sat closer to a door being opened than an order being given. She followed him. Chapter 4. The Iron Alpha's private solar was nothing like the rest of Crestmore Keep. Where the public halls were deliberate in their austerity, stone and iron and the kind of cold that was a statement rather than a temperature, the solar was simply a room where someone had once lived. Bookshelves floor to ceiling on 2 walls, crowded and unsorted in the way of a person who actually read rather than collected. A desk buried under maps and correspondence that was now 13 months old and had gathered the particular stillness of things that had been waiting. A fireplace large enough to stand in, cold and dark, the ash in it undisturbed since the night its owner had walked out of this room and not come back. Cain crossed to the fireplace without pausing and built a fire with the automatic efficiency of a man performing a task he had done 10,000 times. Sable stood near the door and watched him, and tried to organize the last hour of her life into something with a comprehensible shape. She could not. The fire caught. The room changed, the cold retreating to the edges, the shadows warming to ember, the space becoming something that was almost, provisionally, safe feeling. Cain remained standing, one forearm resting on the stone mantel, his back to her. The firelight picked out the angles of him, the breadth of his shoulders, the particular quality of stillness he carried even in motion, as though he was always conserving something. Sit, he said. I'm fine standing, she said. He turned to look at her over his shoulder. The silver eyes caught the firelight and held it. He did not repeat himself. She sat in the chair nearest the fire, mostly because her legs had been suggesting it for some time and she was tired of arguing with them. He turned fully to face her then, and he studied her in silence for a long enough moment that she had to actively resist the urge to fill it with noise. Tell me about the mark, he said finally. I've told you everything I know. It's a birthmark. My mother called it a hearthmark. She said it was a remnant of the first fire, whatever that means. She said it would protect me. Sable kept her voice level. She disappeared when I was 7 and the mark has not, in the 15 years since, protected me from anything. Something tightened in his jaw. What happened to her? I don't know. The answer was old enough that it came out clean, without the ragged edges it had once carried. She was there and then she wasn't. I was taken in by the keep's charitable roles. Given work. A pause. Given a place to be useful. Given a place to be tolerated, was the more accurate version, but she kept that one inside. Cain was quiet for a moment. Then, the hearthmark is not a birthmark. It is not incidental and it is not merely symbolic. He moved away from the fireplace, crossing to the desk, where he rifled through the old correspondence with the focused certainty of someone who knows exactly what he is looking for and is mildly irritated that everything is where he left it 13 months ago. He extracted a document, old, the edges softened with handling, and held it out to her. She took it. The handwriting was dense and archaic, the ink brown with age. 3rd paragraph, he said. She found it. And the wolves of the earth shall know their sovereign by the mark of the first flame, carried in the blood of the moon's own chosen. She will be without beast, for she is older than the beast. She will be without pack, for she is the origin of the pack. She will carry the hearthmark, and where she places her hands, the cold cannot hold. Sable read it twice. Then she set the document carefully on her knee and looked up at him. This is about me, she said. Yes. You have known about this. Before the curse, you knew this existed. I knew the prophecy. I did not know the person. He sat down across from her, not in the other armchair, but on the low table between them, which put him closer than the furniture arrangement suggested was necessary and at eye level with her, which she suspected was deliberate. My family has held that document for 4 generations. We knew the hearthmark existed. We knew the line that carried it had gone quiet, had been hidden, had perhaps been extinguished. A pause. We did not know it had simply been waiting in my own keep for 22 years, sweeping my warhall floors. Something in his voice on those last words, the faintest register of something that was not quite self-recrimination but lived in the same neighborhood. This is a great deal to absorb, Sable said carefully. I know. You are telling me that I am, what? Prophesied. That I have some ancient power in my bloodline that is why the ice broke when I touched it. Yes. And that my mother hid this. Deliberately. To protect you. His voice was certain in the way of someone who had already reached this conclusion and examined it from multiple angles. The sorcerer who cursed me, he did not curse me at random. He was contracted. Paid. And the power that could break the curse was always going to be yours. If he had known about you, he would have come for you first. The fire popped and settled. Sable absorbed this. Who contracted him? She asked. The silver eyes hardened. My uncle. Gregor. She turned the shape of it over in her mind. The man who had settled into the Iron Alpha's seat with such comfortable speed, who had immediately begun restructuring the pack hierarchy, redistributing lands, tightening his grip on Crestmore's resources, who had planned a feast to formalize his claim in 4 days' time. The picture assembled itself with a clarity that was almost insulting in its simplicity. There is something else, Cain said. His voice had changed. Not the controlled authority of the previous several minutes. Something more careful. More deliberate. The voice of a man who is accustomed to saying difficult things directly and is, for the first time in recent memory, uncertain about the most direct route. She waited. When you freed me, he said, and I breathed, the first thing I scented was you. A pause. The only thing. Sable was quiet. You know what that means, he said. In our world, you have lived in a pack keep your entire life. She did know. She had heard it described in 100 different ways over 22 years of invisibility, overheard in corridors, spoken across tables in rooms where she was too unimportant to warrant lowering voices. The moment of recognition, the scent that eclipsed every other, the mate bond, the oldest and most irrevocable of the wolf's instincts, the thing that could not be manufactured or chosen or escaped. She knew what it meant. She also knew what she was. No, she said. He blinked. In the space of that blink she registered that this was possibly not a word Cain Aldric encountered with significant frequency. No, she said again, steadier. I understand what you're implying and I am telling you, with respect, that it is not possible. I am packless. I am shiftless. I have no wolf, no rank, no family name that means anything to anyone. I have been the least significant person in this keep for my entire life, and I cannot be. She stopped. Reorganized. You have been encased in ice for 13 months. You just woke up. Your senses have been sealed for over a year, and the first thing you breathed was whatever residual magic was in the air when the curse broke. You are mistaken. The silence that followed was the specific silence of immovable object encountering irresistible force. I am not mistaken, he said. You could be. I have never been mistaken about anything in my life, he said, and the extraordinary thing was that it did not sound like arrogance. It sounded like a man stating a frustrating personal fact. There is a first time, Sable said. Something crossed his face then, and she braced herself, because she had just contradicted the Iron Alpha twice in the span of 2 minutes and she was not entirely sure what that historically resulted in. But what crossed his face was not anger. It was something startled and bright, quickly controlled, that looked, impossibly, like the beginning of amusement. He rose from the table. He crossed the distance between them in 2 steps and crouched before her chair, which put his face level with hers and his presence at a proximity that made the hearthmark hum so loudly she could feel it in her jaw. Sable. His voice was low. I have been alone in the ice for 13 months. Conscious. Unable to move, to speak, to act, to help the people I was responsible for. 13 months of silence and cold and watching my uncle dismantle everything I built. He held her gaze with absolute steadiness. The only warmth I felt in 13 months was when you put your hand on the ice. Every morning. She stopped breathing for a moment. I do not know what you are yet, he continued. I do not know the full breadth of what that mark means or what your bloodline carries. But I know what I scented when I breathed, and I know that the prophecy is real, and I know that you are not nobody. His voice did not rise. It did not need to. You are mine. And I am yours. And I understand that you require time and evidence before you will accept that. So I am telling you now, at the beginning, so that there is no confusion about where we stand. The fire crackled. Outside the solar window, the keep was beginning to stir with the sounds of early morning, distant bells, the movement of the waking household. Sable looked at the Iron Alpha crouched before her like a man petitioning rather than commanding. I require considerably more than time and evidence, she said at last. I have considerably more, he said. And 4 days before the reclamation feast, which we are going to use. He stood, the decision apparently made to his satisfaction. You will stay in these rooms. Davin will bring you food and clothing. You will not return to the servants' quarters. You cannot simply. Someone put their boot into you. His voice dropped to something very quiet and very dangerous. Davin told me that as well. This Myra Voss. The silver eyes were iron now, every trace of the almost warmth gone. Tell me what she has done. It was phrased as a request. It was delivered as something with considerably more force. An alpha command threaded through with something more personal. A fury that was not cold and calculating but immediate and visceral. It bypassed her careful architecture of self-protection and landed some way unguarded. She told him. Not everything, not the full 22 years. She kept it brief, factual, stripped of the emotion she had spent years packing tightly away. Myra's particular cruelties. Peck's hands. The keep's thorough and committed indifference to the well-being of its packless floor staff. With each sentence, Cain went more still. It was not the stillness of the ice. It was the stillness of something containing itself at significant cost, a barely visible tremor in his jaw, the slow closing of one fist at his side. The fire behind him shrank back fractionally, as though the heat in the room was being reorganized around the heat of his rage and the flame was simply being courteous. When she finished, he said nothing for a long moment. Then, she will be at the reclamation feast. She will be at the center of it, Sable confirmed. Her father is Grigor's chief advisor. Good. The word was not good in any warm sense. It was good in the sense of the target has presented itself. He looked at her steadily. I want her to see you walk in beside me. I want to watch her face when she understands what she put her hands on. Sable felt something move through her chest that was complicated and warm and not entirely comfortable. And Gregor? Gregor will be dealt with at the feast, he said. Publicly. Absolutely. But carefully. He tilted his head slightly. Unless you have an objection to carefully. She thought about Myra's voice. He does not know you are alive. She thought about what it would look like. The Iron Alpha returning not to an empty throne but to a throne with her standing beside it. What that would cost Gregor. What it would cost Myra. What it would mean for every person in the keep who had been small and frightened under Gregor's reign. No, she said. Carefully is exactly right. Something settled in his expression. Not satisfaction, precisely, recognition. As though she had confirmed something he had already suspected and was relieved to have verified. Rest, he said. While you can. The next 4 days will not be gentle. He moved toward the door, then paused without turning. Sable. Yes. You said your mother told you the hearthmark would protect you, and that it never did. A pause. It was protecting you the entire time. It was keeping you unremarkable. Keeping you hidden from the thing that would have found you if you had shone the way you were meant to. He glanced back over his shoulder, and in the firelight his expression was stripped of the Iron Alpha entirely and was simply a man saying a true thing. You were never nothing. You were the most important person in this keep. You simply had the misfortune of being surrounded by people too blind to see it. He left. Sable sat alone by the fire for a long time. The hearthmark glowed warm and steady against her skin, and for the first time in 22 years, she did not reach up to cover it. Chapter 5. The solar became her world for 2 days. It was a disorienting transformation, the kind that happens too quickly for the mind to properly process, so the body simply moves through it with a faint sense of unreality, waiting for the moment it will all be taken back. Sable had spent 22 years in the servants' dormitory, on a pallet thin enough to feel the stone beneath it, eating what was left after the household had been fed. Now she slept in a bed with 4 carved posts and a quilt thick enough to lose things in, and she ate food that had been prepared with the intent that someone should actually enjoy it, and the fire in the solar hearth was never allowed to go out. She kept waiting for Peck to appear in the doorway with a schedule and a list of failures. He did not appear. No one did, except Davin, quiet, efficient, and possessed of the remarkable ability to communicate volumes with the precise angle of his eyebrows, and a small, serious woman named Petra who arrived on the first morning with a measuring cord and an expression of focused professional purpose and said nothing at all except the dimensions she was recording under her breath. Cain came and went. He was not, she was discovering, a man who sat still for long. The 13 months of enforced immobility seemed to have produced in him an acute and restless need to move, to act, to put things in order. She heard him through the solar walls, the low murmur of voices in the adjoining study, the occasional silence that meant maps were being consulted, the rare sharp word that meant something had been discovered in Gregor's administration that had not yet reached the full capacity of his fury. But he came to the solar, every few hours, and sat across from her, and talked. She had not expected that. She had expected commands, perhaps, or the brisk information transfer of a man who needed her functional and compliant for a specific purpose. She had not expected him to settle into the chair across from hers with the careful movements of a man managing a body that had been still for too long, and simply tell her things. He told her about the prophecy. Not the paragraph she had already read, but the full body of lore his family had accumulated across 4 generations. Fragmentary, contradictory in places, assembled from half a dozen sources that agreed on the essential shape of the thing even when they disagreed on the details. A bloodline older than the wolf packs. A lineage that had existed before the moon goddess gave the first shifting gift, that carried a different kind of power entirely. Not the power of the beast, but the power of the flame that had existed before the beast. The first warmth. The original fire from which all other warmth descended. The wolves came from the wild, he said on the first evening, the fire burning low between them, both of them with their feet on the hearth in the unceremonious way of people who have moved past performing comfort at each other. From the hunt and the cold and the dark. The hearthmark line came from the opposite impulse. From the fire that made the cold survivable. From the choice to stay, to build, to protect. He looked at the mark on her collarbone, visible now above the neckline of the clean dress Petra had produced that morning. A simple thing, dark wool, better than anything Sable had owned in her life. The 2 lines were always meant to find each other. The wolf and the flame. The wild and the hearth. They are not opposites. They are complements. That is a very elegant explanation for a mate bond, Sable said. It is also the correct one, he said, without heat. She looked at him for a moment. You are very certain about things. I am certain about the things I have verified, he said. I am aware that this appears, from the outside, like certainty about everything. It is a known criticism. How do you respond to it? The silver eyes held a glimmer of something dry and self-aware. I verify more things. She laughed. It surprised her, the laugh itself, the ease of it, the fact that she was sitting by a fire in the Iron Alpha's private solar laughing at something the Iron Alpha had said while the hearthmark hummed warmly against her skin and the world outside the door had temporarily agreed to leave her alone. Cain looked at her when she laughed the way a man looks at a fire he has just managed to light in a wind, with a fierce, quiet satisfaction that he was visibly trying not to make obvious. On the second day, he told her about the sorcerer. His name had been Varel. He had come from the Eastern Territories, a practitioner of cold magic, not the wolf's earth magic, not the hearthmark's fire, but something harvested from entropy itself, from the energy of things ending. He had been, by all accounts, extraordinarily powerful and extraordinarily expensive. Gregor approached him 2 years before the curse, Cain said. He was standing at the window, looking out at the grey courtyard below, his arms crossed over his chest in the posture of a man reviewing intelligence with the dispassion of a commander and the barely contained fury of a person who has been profoundly wronged. I know this because Davin found the correspondence in Gregor's vault. Letters. 13 of them, spanning 18 months of negotiation. A pause. My uncle is meticulous. He was also arrogant enough to believe he would never be caught. What did Varel want in exchange? Sable asked. Territory. Specifically, the cold fen marshes in the eastern reach of the Pack lands. Ancient sorcerer's territory, reclaimed by the Pack 3 generations ago. He turned from the window. Gregor promised him the deed on the night the curse took hold. The night he became Lord of Crestmore. His jaw tightened. He has been paying Varel in smaller installments in the meantime. Resources. Excess. Protection from the Pack's rangers. And Varel, he is still out there. He is still out there, Cain confirmed. And he will know the curse has broken. Cold magic has a resonance. When a working that size fails, The practitioner feels it. He looked at her steadily. He will come. Not immediately. He will want to understand what happened before he acts. But he will come. The knowledge settled over her like a cold hand. He'll come for me. He will try, Cain said, and the simplicity of the correction, not no but try, was more reassuring than any elaborate promise would have been. You are not what you were 2 days ago. You were not what you appeared to be for 22 years. What you did to that ice, the power that came through you, it is not a fixed quantity. It is not a trick you performed once that cannot be repeated. He crossed the room and crouched before her chair again, which she was beginning to understand was his chosen method of ensuring eye contact when he wanted her to actually hear something. It is what you are. It lives in you the way my wolf lives in me. It is not something you did. It is something you are. She looked at her collarbone, at the warm glow of the mark. I don't know how to use it deliberately. It just happened. I know. Most wolves cannot shift deliberately for the first year. They shift when the emotion is strong enough to force it. The instinct comes before the control. He held her gaze. The control comes from understanding what you are, from trusting it. You make it sound straightforward. It is not straightforward, he said. It is the work of a lifetime. But it begins with knowing that the power is yours. Not borrowed, not accidental, not something that happened to you once in a strange moment and may never happen again. A pause. It is you. She held the steadiness of his eyes for a moment, the silver of them, the absolute conviction in them, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not dramatically, not the cataclysmic fracturing of the ice. More like a door that had been shut for a very long time, not locked, simply forgotten, opening a careful inch. You are not afraid of it, she said. What I am, what my power might mean. No, most people would be. I am not most people. He said it without arrogance, as a plain statement of observable fact. And your power is not a threat to me. It is. He paused, which was unusual enough that she paid close attention to what came after it. It is the thing I felt through the ice every morning for 13 months. Warmth, when there was no warmth. The knowledge that I was not entirely alone. Something moved through his expression. I have been afraid of very few things in my life. Being alone in that ice was one of them. A beat. You took it away. The fire crackled between them. Sable became very interested in a thread loose on the cuff of her dress. I didn't know you could feel it, she said quietly. Every morning, he said. Every single morning. The gown arrived on the evening of the second day. Petra brought it herself, draped over both arms with the reverence of someone transporting something that had cost significant effort and intended to make sure that was understood. She laid it across the bed in the Solar's adjoining chamber and stepped back, and Sable stood in the doorway and looked at it. It was the color of a flame at its hottest, not orange, not red, but the deep, true amber gold of a fire burning at its cleanest, with an underdress of copper silk that caught the light and threw it back in shifting warm fragments. The bodice was structured, the neckline precisely calculated to display the hearthmark without apology, the skirt full enough to move like something alive. Along the hem and the cuffs, Petra had worked a border of embroidery in dark thread, small repeating shapes that Sable leaned in to examine and recognized, with a cold thread of wonder, as flames. Dozens of them, stitched in the last 2 days by hands that had somehow known what they were making even before Sable had fully understood what she was. Where did she find this fabric in 2 days? Sable asked. She didn't find it, Davin said from the doorway behind her, his tone suggesting mild amusement at a question with an obvious answer. Lord Aldric described what he wanted and she made it. She has been working since yesterday morning. Sable turned to look at him. He described it. In considerable detail, I'm told. Davin's eyebrows performed their eloquent work. He had a specific image in mind. She looked back at the gown, at the precise amber gold of it, the color of the hearthmark's glow, at the flames worked along the hem. The door to the study opened and Cain appeared, still dressed for the work of the day, a document in his hand that he was in the process of reading. He looked up, saw the gown on the bed, saw her face, and stopped. It needs to say something, he said. Not apologetically, explanatorily. Tomorrow night, every person in that hall is going to see you for the first time. The story they tell themselves about you in the first 30 seconds is the story they will carry forward. I want the story to be correct. And what story is that? She asked. He looked at her steadily. That you are not a maid who got lucky. That you are not an omega who married well. That you are a power in your own right who has been in this keep for 22 years and was worth more than every person in it. And the only tragedy is that it took a curse and a prophecy for anyone to notice. He looked at the gown, then back at her. That is what the dress says. I thought it was important to say it loudly. Sable was quiet for a moment. You are, she said carefully, a surprisingly articulate man for someone whose primary reputation involves making armies reconsider their life choices. The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was the structural precondition of one, the territory a smile would occupy, if a smile was something the Iron Alpha permitted himself. Sleep, he said. Tomorrow is the reclamation feast. The almost smile disappeared, replaced by the cold precision of a man finalizing a strategy. Tomorrow, my uncle discovers what he has done, and everyone who profited from his theft of my seat will discover it with him. He looked at her one final time, and the silver eyes held something layered, the fury of the commander, yes, but beneath it the particular warmth she was learning to recognize. The warmth of a man who had spent 13 months in the cold and had decided, with the full force of his considerable conviction, never to be cold again. You will not be alone in that hall, he said quietly. Not for a single moment. She believed him. That was the most surprising thing of all. Not the gown, not the prophecy, not the slow and careful way the bond between them had been building across 2 days of firelight and honesty. The most surprising thing was how completely, and how easily, she believed him. Chapter 6. The great hall of Crestmore Keep had not been this full since the night it broke. Torches burned in every iron bracket, doubling themselves in the polished obsidian of the floor. The long tables had been dressed in Gregor's colors, deep gray and cold silver, the colors of the Aldric seat repurposed to announce a new occupancy, the way a conquering army repaints the gates. Every surface that could hold a candle did. Every surface that could hold food did that too. Haunches of venison and whole roasted birds and pyramids of autumn fruit that had cost more than Sable's yearly food allowance, arranged with the specific extravagance of a man who needed everyone in the room to understand that he had won. Lord Gregor Aldric sat at the head of the hall. He was not a physically impressive man, not in the way the seat demanded, not in the way his nephew had been. He was narrow through the shoulder, careful in his movements, with the lean watchful face of a man who had spent his life in the margins of power and had learned to read rooms the way a predator reads terrain. His wolf was real but unremarkable, a mid-level dominance that he had supplemented across a career with the more reliable tools of patience and ruthlessness. He wore a circlet of hammered iron, not a crown, carefully not a crown, because the formalization of the seat transfer was the purpose of tonight, and he wore it with the suppressed satisfaction of a man who has wanted something for a very long time and is finally holding it. He raised his goblet. To the territory of Iron Hold, he announced, his voice carrying the length of the hall with practiced ease. To the memory of my nephew, whose sacrifice, however it came, has given us the opportunity to build something stronger, something more considered. A meaningful pause, a gesture at the assembled company, alphas of allied houses, packmaster families, noble lines that had been cultivating relationships with Gregor for the 13 months of his regency, all of them calculating, all of them invested. To a new era, to Crestmore, and to those who have the vision to guide it forward. The toast went up. 100 goblets raised. A ragged cheer, not wholehearted. There were people in this room who had loved Cain Aldric, or at least respected him, or at minimum understood that what Gregor was doing had a specific name that civilized people did not say aloud, but loud enough. Loud enough for Gregor to settle back in his chair with the look of a man ticking an item off a very long list. Myra Voss stood near the high table, resplendent in midnight blue, her dark eyes moving through the crowd with the systematic attention of a woman conducting inventory. She was looking for Sable. It had begun as mild irritation. The packless floor girl had not appeared for her morning duties, had not appeared for the midday service, had sent no message through Peck, had simply ceased to exist in the household schedule with the aggravating completeness of a dropped stitch. Myra had asked Peck, who had gone grey at the question and said only that he believed the matter was above his authority, which had made no sense and had lodged itself in her mind as a piece of grit lodges in a boot. She scanned the hall systematically. Floor staff lined the walls in their grey livery, eyes correctly downcast, pitchers and trays at the ready. She found 2 girls who occupied the general perimeter of Sable's usual stations, and neither of them was her. A flicker of unease. She suppressed it. The girl had probably fled before the snow. Packless strays did that. They felt the shift in the air before the weather turned and they ran for lower ground. It was, frankly, the most sensible thing the creature had ever done. Myra turned her attention back to the room. At the far end of the hall, near the servants' access corridor, the older guard Davin stood at his post with an expression of complete professional neutrality that Myra had always found faintly irritating. He had served the Aldric seat for 2 decades and had never, in Myra's experience, adjusted his loyalty 1 degree toward Gregor regardless of the gifts and positioning her father had attempted. He was looking at the main doors. She followed his gaze. The main doors were closed. The music was the first thing to change. It did not stop, it faltered. A single missed beat from the string quartet near the east wall. The kind of stumble that happens when a musician's attention breaks, when something in the room claims priority over the notes on the page. It was small enough that most guests did not consciously register it. Then the temperature dropped. Not dramatically, just enough. The particular edge that comes into air when something is about to happen, the atmospheric equivalent of a sharp intake of breath. Candle flames bent simultaneously toward the main doors as though curious. Lord Gregor noticed. His eyes moved to the doors with the reflexive alertness of a careful man, and his hand tightened fractionally on his goblet. The doors opened. Not with ceremony. Not with announcement. They simply opened, both panels simultaneously, and the cold of the corridor outside entered the hall in a clean, decisive draft that made the nearest torches gutter and the nearest guest step involuntarily aside. Cain Aldric walked in. The silence came in waves, spreading outward from the doors the way ripples spread from a stone dropped in still water. First the guests nearest the entrance, who saw him first and stopped speaking mid-sentence with the completeness of a sentence meeting a wall, then the next ring outward, then the next, the quiet racing through the hall faster than sound, until the string quartet simply stopped and the entire vast space held nothing but the percussion of Cain's footsteps on the obsidian floor. He was dressed in black from collar to boot, without ornament, without the regalia of the seat, no circlet, no chain of office, no deliberate display of rank. He needed none of it. He walked into the hall the way a river walks into the sea, with the complete and absolute authority of something that has always belonged there and is simply returning to its correct place. His face was the face from the war hall, severe and uncompromising, the jaw set with a precision that suggested every word that would come out of it tonight had been weighed and selected. His silver eyes swept the hall in a single arc, not searching, cataloguing, and landed on his uncle at the head of the table. He did not walk toward the high table. He stopped, 10 feet inside the doors, and waited. The hall breathed. Gregor had gone the color of the stone walls. His goblet descended to the table with a sound that, in the silence, was very loud. His face moved through disbelief, through the rapid internal recalculation of a careful man updating a model that had catastrophically failed him, through the first edges of something that was not quite fear but was closely related to it. "Nephew," he said. His voice was admirably steady. "This is, how?" "Gregor." Cain's voice filled the hall without apparent effort, the alpha resonance in it moving through the assembled guests like a pressure change. "You seem to be sitting in my chair." A sound ran through the crowd, not a gasp, exactly. The collective exhalation of a room full of people releasing a tension they had been holding for 13 months. Then Cain turned his head. He looked toward the side entrance, the east passage, where Davin had positioned himself, where the shadows were deepest, where the candlelight reached only in suggestions, where Sable stood. She had been there for 4 minutes, which had been 4 of the longest minutes of her life. Davin had placed her there himself, with the quiet precision of a man who had thought carefully about sightlines and timing and the specific theatrical value of a figure revealed rather than announced. She was in the shadows, but not hidden, positioned at the precise point where the candlelight from the hall's nearest torch would find her when she stepped forward, where the guests at the nearest tables would see her before the ones further away, where the story would travel through the room at the right pace. She was wearing the amber gold gown. The hearthmark was bare, glowing softly at her throat, visible above the neckline that had been precisely designed to display it. Her dark hair had been dressed by Petra that afternoon in a style simple enough to be elegant and deliberate enough to be unmistakable, a woman who had been prepared, not pressed. She stood with her hands quiet at her sides and her spine straight and her heart hammering so loudly she was mildly concerned that the guests at the nearest table could hear it. Cain found her. She watched it happen from across the hall. Watched his silver eyes locate her in the shadows with the ease of a man who had always known exactly where she was, Watch the severity of his expression shift in that particular way. She was learning, not softening, never quite that, but the quality of the steel changing, becoming something chosen rather than something armored. He began to walk toward her, not toward the high table, not toward his uncle, still sitting at the head of the hall with the careful expression of a man remapping reality, not toward the center of the room, where the crowd had parted with the unconscious deference of people in the presence of a dominant force. Toward her, directly, unhurriedly, through the center of the hall, the crowd folding back before him without being asked, a corridor opening between the Frost King and the girl in the amber-gold gown as though the room itself understood the geometry of the moment. Every eye in the hall followed him. Every eye found her. She felt the weight of it, 100 assessments arriving simultaneously, 100 stories beginning their first sentences. Who is she? What is she? Where did she come from? Why is he? He stopped before her. The hall was absolutely silent. He reached out and took her hand, not her wrist, not a grip of possession, but her hand, the full warm clasp of it, his fingers closing over hers with a deliberateness that was its own kind of statement. He raised it and pressed his lips to her knuckles, and the gesture was not courtly performance. It was an acknowledgement, a man bowing to a fact. He straightened, tucked her hand into the crook of his arm, and turned to face the assembled hall. "You gathered tonight to witness a transfer of power," he said, his voice carrying to every corner with the ease of a man who had never needed to raise it to be heard. "You will witness one, but it will not be the one you were invited for." His silver gaze moved over the crowd, lingering a moment on Myra Voss, who had gone rigid near the high table, her face a mask of controlled shock, her eyes moving between Cain and Sable with the rapid recalculation of someone watching their certainties evaporate. "This is Sable. She carries the hearthmark of the first flame bloodline. She freed me from the sorcerers working 4 nights ago with a power that has been living in this keep, unrecognized and unprotected, for 22 years. A pause, quiet and precise as a blade finding its edge. She is my mate. She will be your lady of Crestmore. Her word carries my authority. Her enemies are my enemies." His gaze moved to his uncle. "Gregor." The name was a sentence in itself. Gregor Aldric rose from the chair slowly, with the careful movements of a man who was running, very rapidly, out of options. His eyes moved to the guards lining the walls. His guards, Gregor's men, the ones who had been loyal to him for 13 months. He found Davin. He found the faces of the other guards, and he found in them the same thing, not hostility, exactly, but an absolute and complete reorientation of allegiance that had happened. It was clear, some time ago, and had simply been waiting for this moment to become visible. "This is theater," Gregor said, his voice sharp. "The boy has been unconscious for 13 months, his mind addled by the working. He is not fit." "Davin," Cain said. Davin stepped forward, and in his hands was a document. The correspondence, the 13 letters, the meticulous paper trail of a careful man who had been arrogant enough to keep the evidence of his own crime. "We found these in your private vault," Davin said, his voice carrying the formal weight of a man making an official record. "Letters between yourself and the sorcerer Varel of the Eastern Reach, spanning 18 months. Detailing the terms of the curse, the payment schedule, and the territorial concessions you promised in exchange for your nephew's imprisonment." He looked up. "Witnessed by myself, by 3 senior pack wardens, and by the Lord's own seal on every page." The hall erupted. Not in chaos, in sound. The controlled, disbelieving sound of a room full of political creatures rapidly reassessing every decision they had made in the last 13 months. Gregor's allies looked at each other with the expressions of people calculating exactly how much of this they had known, and exactly how deniable their association was, and exactly how quickly they could begin demonstrating loyalty to the man currently standing in the center of the hall holding the situation by the throat. Myra's face, Sable noted, had gone the color of old bone. Their eyes met across the hall. Sable held the gaze steadily. She did not smile. She did not perform triumph. She simply looked, and let Myra see her, not the shadow girl, not the packless floor staff, not the creature without a name worth remembering. The woman in the amber gold gown with the hearthmark burning at her throat and the iron alpha's hand covering hers. Myra looked away first. "Gregor Aldric," Cain said, and the hall fell quiet again with a speed that demonstrated exactly how completely the room had recalibrated. "You contracted a sorcerer to imprison your lord. You allowed the pack's resources to be stripped, its loyal members punished, its alliances weakened, for 13 months of personal gain. He looked at his uncle without anger, which was, Sable had come to understand, more frightening than anger would have been. Cold fury was simply weather. This was judgment. You will answer for it. Fully. Beginning now. He nodded once. Davin's men moved. Chapter 7. Gregor did not go quietly. He had the presence of mind not to run. He was too calculating for that, too aware of how the room would read it, too committed to the performance of dignity even as the performance collapsed around him. He stood at the head of the table and drew himself up with the bearing of a man who had spent decades managing perceptions and intended to manage this one too, right up until the moment it became impossible. You have letters, he said, his voice carrying the careful modulation of a man buying seconds to think. Letters can be fabricated. A sorcerer's working can be misattributed. The law of the Ironhold seat requires. The law of the Ironhold seat, Cain said, requires the testimony of 3 senior pack wardens and physical evidence of the crime. You are looking at both. He tilted his head a fraction. I wrote that law. I know exactly what it requires. A muscle moved in Gregor's jaw. His eyes moved across the room one final time. A last scan for an exit, a leverage point, an ally who had not yet finished calculating their position. He found none. The allied alphas along the high table had developed a collective and urgent interest in their goblets. The noble families in the body of the hall had the expressions of people who have just remembered a prior commitment. Gregor's personal guard, for men stationed near the east wall, looked at Davin's contingent arrayed across from them and arrived at an arithmetic they did not like. One of them set his spear down. The sound of it on the stone floor was very deliberate. The other 3 followed within seconds. Gregor's composure cracked. Not dramatically, not the theatrical collapse of a villain in a story, but the specific, ugly fracture of a careful man watching every careful thing he has built reveal itself as scaffolding. His face went through something private and terrible, and then it went still, and then he said, very quietly, "You were supposed to stay in the ice." "I know," Cain said. Just that. No anger, no satisfaction. The 2 words of a man who has received a confession and is now simply filing it in its correct location. Davin's men moved to either side of Gregor with the efficient choreography of people who had planned this in some detail. Gregor allowed himself to be taken, because there was nothing else to do, because the room was watching, because the last tool available to him was the dignity of not making it worse, and he was walked toward the hall's side passage with the careful pace of a man who was not yet willing to admit it was over, even though it was entirely over. The hall watched him go. Then, as one, it turned back to Cain. Myra Voss. Cain's voice was not raised. It did not need to be. The name landed in the newly quiet hall with the precision of something thrown accurately, and every head turned to find its subject. Myra had not moved from her position near the high table. She was too controlled for that, too aware of every eye in the room, too experienced in the social mechanics of a public gathering to make the mistake of attempting to become invisible when invisibility was no longer possible. She stood with her chin lifted and her expression composed into something that might, from a distance, have passed for calm. Up close, Sable could see her hands. They were very still. The stillness of someone who has decided, consciously, not to let them shake. "My Lord Aldric." Myra's voice was steady, precisely calibrated. "I am glad to see your return. I want to assure you that my father and I have served this household to the best of our. My mate has something to say to you," Cain said. The sentence was simple. The weight of it was not. It was not a softening. It was a transfer, a deliberate extension of the full authority of the moment from him to her, in front of every person in the hall. A statement about where power lived in this keep, made in the most public language available. Every eye in the hall moved to Sable. She felt it, the collective attention arriving like weather, like something with physical mass. She had spent 22 years being invisible in rooms exactly like this one, carrying trays along the walls, keeping her gaze correctly downcast, existing in the precise margins of every event she served. She knew the architecture of this hall better than anyone in it. She had swept its floors, scrubbed its flagstones, refilled its candles in the hours before dawn when it was empty and cold and entirely her own. She was not invisible now. She stepped forward. Her feet were steady. She had not expected that, had expected the fear to translate into something physical, some evidence of the girl she had been, but her body seemed to have made a decision independent of her nerves. The amber gold gown moved with her, the candlelight finding the copper underdress and throwing it back warm, the hearthmark at her throat glowing with a steadiness that felt like a second heartbeat. She stopped 6 feet from Myra Voss and simply looked at her. Myra looked back. The composed expression was intact, but beneath it something had changed. The quality of her stillness had shifted from controlled to careful, the difference between a person managing a performance and a person managing fear. "I am not going to tell you every specific thing you did," Sable said. Her voice came out clear and level and with an authority she did not have to reach for. It was simply there, as though it had always been there and had only been waiting for a room large enough to use it in. "You know what you did. Every person you struck, every name you used, every small and deliberate cruelty you practiced on people you believed would never be in a position to account for it. You know all of it." A pause. "So do I." Myra's jaw tightened. A nearly imperceptible motion. "I performed my duties as." "You performed your enjoyment," Sable said, quietly. "There is a difference, and you know there is a difference." She held the other woman's gaze for a moment longer, letting the silence be what it was. Then she looked at Cain. He was watching her with the expression she had come to recognize. The severe face, the controlled stillness, and beneath both of them the particular quality of attention that meant he was not managing this moment but simply present in it. Fully. The way he was present in everything. She gave a small, precise nod. He spoke. "Myra Voss," Cain said, "for the abuse of your position over the household staff of Crestmore Keep, for the deliberate and sustained cruelty directed at persons under this house's protection, and for conduct unworthy of the rank your family's service to this seat granted you." He paused. Not for drama, for precision, the pause of a man ensuring every word that follows is exact. "You are removed from your position within this household, effective immediately. Your family's advisory role is suspended pending a full review of your father's conduct during the regency. You will remain within the keep grounds under observation until that review is complete." His silver eyes held hers without heat, without the anger she might have expected, which was somehow worse. "You will also report to the household steward's office tomorrow morning for a reassignment to general staff duties." A sound ran through the hall. Not shock, recognition. The particular sound of a room full of people watching someone receive exactly what they had coming. Myra's composure broke. Not in tears. She was not a woman who wept in public. It broke in the precise, ugly way that pride breaks when it is brought into contact with consequence, a rapid sequence of expressions crossing her face before she could manage them. Disbelief, then fury, then the dawning of something that might, eventually, with sufficient time and sufficient difficulty, become understanding. "You can't," she started. "It is done," Cain said. Simply. Davin appeared at Myra's elbow with the quiet efficiency of a man who had been waiting for this cue. She looked at him, looked at the hall, looked at Sable one final time. Sable met her eyes without performance, without triumph and without apology. Myra looked away. She walked out under her own power, which was the last dignity available to her, and she took it. The hall exhaled. It was a collective, physical thing, the release of a tension that had been accumulating for 13 months, that had been present in every forced toast and every careful political calculation and every quiet conversation conducted in lowered voices in the margins of Gregor's gatherings. It left the room lighter, the way a room is lighter after a window is opened. Cain ascended to the head of the hall. He did not take the chair, Gregor's chair, which had been the Iron Alpha's chair and would be again, but which still held the occupancy of the last 13 months in the set of its cushion and the placement of the goblet beside it. He stood before it, and he turned, and he looked at the assembled court of Ironhold. Then he held out his hand to Sable. She crossed the hall to him. The path was clear, not because anyone moved to clear it, but because the room understood the geometry of the moment and arranged itself accordingly. She took his hand and he drew her to his side, and they stood together before the high seat of Crestmore Keep, and the meaning of the composition was unmistakable. "Ironhold has been bleeding," Cain said. The hall was perfectly quiet. "You know it. I know it. The outer settlements have been taxed into difficulty, alliances have been strained by mismanagement, and the pack's resources have been redirected toward the comfort of a regency that never had the right to exist." He looked across the assembled faces, the allied alphas, some of them guilty, some merely complicit, some simply afraid, all of them watching him with the acute attention of people who understood that the next words would determine the shape of their immediate futures. "I am not interested in prosecuting every person in this room who made accommodations for Gregor's rule. You made them because the alternative was worse, and I understand the arithmetic of survival. A pause. But hear me clearly. That era is finished. The accommodations are finished. What begins tonight is an accounting, and then, after the accounting, a rebuilding. His hand tightened fractionally over Sable's. Under my rule. Under our rule. Our. The word moved through the hall in a wave, rippling outward from the high table. Eyes moved to Sable, to the hearthmark at her throat, to the amber gold gown, to the composed steadiness of a woman who had every reason to be overwhelmed and was not. The assessments were rapid and visible, and she let them happen, meeting each one without flinching. A man near the front of the hall, a packmaster from the northern settlements, broad and grey-bearded, whose name Sable had heard Cain speak with respect during their 2 days of preparation, went slowly to one knee. He said nothing. He simply knelt. The allied alpha beside him, after a moment's pause, did the same. It moved through the hall like the silence had moved, in waves, outward from the front, the rustle and clink of formal dress and weapons as the court of Ironhold descended to its knees. Not all of them immediately, not all of them with equal willingness, not all of them without the visible calculation of people making a choice rather than following an instinct. But all of them. Eventually. All of them. Sable stood at Cain Aldric's side and looked out at a hall full of people kneeling, and felt the full impossible weight of it, not as burden, but as fact. The girl who had swept these floors. The packless shadow who had not existed to any of them 48 hours ago. Standing in the place where the power of Crestmore Keep resided and looking out at every person who had constituted her entire world and finding, to her own quiet astonishment, that she was not afraid. She was home. Cain turned to her in the moment before he would have to speak again, in the breath between the kneeling and the next thing, and looked at her with an expression that had nothing of the Iron Alpha in it whatsoever. It was simply a man looking at a woman, with an intensity of relief and devotion and something so raw it had not yet acquired a name. Well, he said, very quietly, for her alone. She looked at the hall, at the kneeling court, the high table, the torches burning warm in their brackets, the floor she had swept 10,000 times now holding the weight of an entirely different kind of history. Ask me again in a year, she said, equally quiet. When I believe it. The corner of his mouth moved. The almost smile, closer this time than she had yet seen it. I will ask you every day, he said, until you do. He turned back to the hall. She stood beside him. The reckoning was over. What came next was theirs to build. Chapter 8. The hall emptied slowly, the way halls always empty after enormous things have happened in them, not all at once, but in gradual layers, the most politically urgent departures first, then the opportunists repositioning themselves for the new order, then the genuinely shaken, and finally the loyal ones who stayed to help dismantle the evening and restore the space to something that could be slept beside. Cain spent 2 hours in the hall after the formal proceedings concluded, which Sable spent mostly near the fire with Davin and the grey-bearded packmaster from the north, whose name was Aldous, and who turned out to be a man of extraordinarily dry humor and a genuine talent for making strong tea appear from nowhere, listening to the initial shape of what Ironhold's reconstruction was going to require. It was, she discovered, considerable. Gregor had been meticulous in his extraction. Taxes on the outer settlements increased incrementally over 13 months, each increase small enough to be managed, the cumulative effect devastating. Trade agreements renegotiated quietly in Gregor's favor. Loyal pack wardens reassigned to remote postings or encouraged toward early retirement. The pack's war chest quietly redistributed into personal accounts that would require forensic examination to fully trace. It was the work of a patient and organized man who had planned for exactly this outcome and had used every month of it efficiently. Cain listened to Aldis's report with the stillness of a man filing information for later use, asking precise questions in a voice that gave nothing away. But Sable, who was learning to read the architecture beneath his control, watched his hands. The slow, deliberate closing of one fist, the careful unclosing of it, repeated every few minutes. The pressure valve of a man containing a response he had no useful outlet for yet. When the last of the necessary conversations concluded and the hall was down to its skeleton staff of quietly industrious workers, he found her by the fire and held out his hand without preamble. Come, he said. It was the same word he had used 4 nights ago in the war hall, after the ice broke and the guards arrived and the world rearranged itself around a new geometry. But the quality of it was different now, not the command of a man establishing authority, but the word of a person who has had a very long day and knows exactly where he needs to be. She took his hand. The royal chambers were on the keep's upper floor, accessed through a passage that bypassed the main corridors. A private route that Cain navigated without a lamp, his familiarity with the architecture of his own home evident in the certainty of each turn. Sable followed with her hand in his and the hearthmark warm at her throat and her feet beginning, finally, to register the cumulative effect of standing in formal shoes for 4 hours. The chambers were large and firelit. Petra had been here ahead of them, or someone had, the hearth burning bright and the room stripped of the cold neglect of 13 months and restored, as much as one evening's work could restore it, to the condition of a room that was lived in. Cain moved to the fire and stood before it, his back to her, his forearms on the mantel, his head dropped forward slightly. He was exhausted. Not physically, or not only physically. The exhaustion of a man who has been awake in the dark for 13 months, who has returned to find everything he built partially dismantled, who has spent the first 4 days of his freedom in a state of controlled, purposeful fury and has now reached the far edge of what control costs. Sable crossed the room and stood beside him at the fire. She did not speak. She had learned, across 2 days in the solar, that silence with Cain was not absence. It was a kind of companionship, the quiet of 2 people who did not need to fill space to occupy it together. She stood close enough that the warmth of her was available to him without being imposed, and waited. After a long moment, he said, 13 months. Just that. She understood everything in it. It will take time, she said. Not as comfort, exactly, as fact. She had learned that he received facts better than comfort, that the honest shape of a difficult thing was more useful to him than its softening. The outer settlements will recover faster than the accounts suggest. People are more resilient than ledgers give them credit for. I know. A pause. I am not worried about the settlements. He lifted his head and looked at her sideways, the fire catching the silver of his eyes and turning them briefly amber. I am angry about the time. About what you lived through in those 13 months, in this keep, under his. He stopped. Reorganized. About what you lived through in 22 years, because I was not paying sufficient attention to what was happening in my own household. You couldn't have known. I could have, he said flatly. I was rigorous about the pack's external affairs and careless about its internal ones. I thought if the walls were sound and the warriors were trained and the outer settlements were fed, the inside of the keep managed itself. A muscle moved in his jaw. It did not manage itself. It managed the people in it according to its own hierarchy, and that hierarchy had no mechanism for protecting those at the bottom of it. He looked at her directly. I will not make that mistake again. She held his gaze. No, she agreed. You will not, because I will not let you. The almost smile arrived again, closer still. The territory of a smile, occupied. Good, he said. I need someone who will not let me. The fire settled with a soft collapse of wood, the room dimming and brightening in the same motion. And for a moment they stood in it together without the weight of the evening pressing down, just the warmth and the quiet and the new, tentative shape of something that was being built between them, one honest exchange at a time. Then the fire went out. Not dimmed, not gutted in a draught. Out. Completely, instantaneously, as though it had simply decided to stop. The room plunged into a darkness so absolute it felt deliberate, felt chosen, felt like the dark had been waiting outside the light's perimeter and had simply stepped through it. Cain moved instantly, in front of her, the same reflexive shielding as in the war hall, his body between her and the darkness before she had fully processed the change. We are not alone, he said. His voice was very quiet and very controlled, and underneath both of those qualities was something she had not heard in it before. Not fear. Cain Aldric did not do fear in any recognizable form. But awareness. A sharp, specific alertness of a man who has identified a threat he is not certain he can manage. The darkness in the corner near the window moved. It did not move the way shadows move when a light source shifts. It moved with intention, with a direction it had chosen, pulling itself away from the wall with the slow deliberateness of something that had been patient for a very long time and had now decided patience was no longer necessary. A figure coalesced, tall and angular, dressed in deep gray that bled at the edges into the surrounding dark, with a face that was ageless in the specific way of things that have spent a very long time in proximity to cold magic, neither young nor old, simply preserved, the way something is preserved when the processes that would normally act on it have been arrested. His eyes were colorless. Not pale, actually colorless, the gray of deep ice, the gray of light failing. He looked at Cain first. Then he looked at Sable. And he smiled. The Iron Alpha, Varel said. His voice was the sound of water running under ice, present, purposeful, contained. 13 months of careful work, undone in an evening. He tilted his head slightly, the gesture of a craftsman examining a failure. I felt it break 4 nights ago. I confess it surprised me. I did not think the curse could be broken at all. His colorless eyes moved to Sable and stayed there. And then I felt what broke it, and I understood. Varel. Cain's voice was contained iron. You have made a significant miscalculation in coming here. Have I? The sorcerer's tone was genuinely conversational, the manner of a man who considers himself in a strong enough position to afford curiosity. You are formidable, Lord Aldric. Genuinely. The most powerful alpha I have encountered in 40 years of practice. But your power is of the earth, bone deep and immense and absolutely useless against cold magic. You know this. We both know this. He took a step forward. I am not here for you. His colorless gaze did not move from Sable. Your bloodline should have ended with your mother, he said, and the conversational quality in his voice took on a specific edge, not cruelty, but the flat pragmatism of a professional. I found her 12 years ago. I thought the line was finished. I was told the line was finished. A pause. I was clearly misinformed. Sable felt the cold of it land, not the words themselves but the shape behind them. Her mother. 12 years ago. I found her. Her hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against her thighs and stopped them. Who told you to end the line? She asked. Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. Varel looked faintly interested, the way a man looks when an insect performs an unexpectedly complex maneuver. Gregor Aldric, he said. He has been my patron for 15 years. His interest in the Ironhold seat predates his arrangement with me by some time, but it was I who identified the hearthmark bloodline as the true obstacle to his ambitions. He raised one hand, and the darkness around his fingers deepened, coalesced, took on a texture. The cold working I laid on Lord Aldric was designed to be permanent. Nothing of the earth should have been able to break it. But the first flame. He looked at the hearthmark glowing at her throat with the expression of a man assessing a structural problem. The first flame is the one power in this world older than cold magic. The one power that should not, technically, still exist. But it does, Sable said. Yes, Varel agreed. Which means I have unfinished work. He moved. Cain moved at the same instant. Faster than she had seen him move yet, the speed of an alpha wolf in full defensive response, placing himself entirely between her and the sorcerer. You will not. Varel flicked his wrist. The cold magic hit Cain like a wall. It was not ice, not the slow working of 13 months, not the careful constructed curse. It was blunt force, raw cold concentrated to a point, and it hit him mid-stride and threw him back with a violence that was sickening to witness. He struck the stone wall to her left with a sound that stopped her heart and dropped to one knee, one hand on the floor, his head down. She heard his breathing, still there, still controlled, but with a strain in it that told her the impact had cost him more than he would admit. He tried to rise. His arm buckled. The cold magic had found something, not a fatal vulnerability, but a specific one. The sorcerers working knew Cain's power intimately, had been designed around it, had spent 13 months in contact with him. Varel knew exactly where to hit. Cain. She heard her own voice, the crack in it that she did not have time to manage. Stay back, he said, through his teeth, still trying to rise. Varel walked past him. He walked past the iron alpha on the floor as though he were furniture, with the dismissive ease of a man who has neutralized the only threat he considered real, and he approached Sable with the unhurried pace of someone performing a task they have been contracted for. I bear you no personal animosity, he said. This is professional. She had no weapon, no training, no wolf, no rank, no armor. She had the gown and the hearthmark and 2 hands that had broken a 13-month ice curse 4 nights ago by pressing themselves against stone. She had no time to think. She did not think. She raised both hands, the same instinct as in the war hall, the same unreasoning physical certainty, and she pressed them outward toward the advancing sorcerer, palms forward, as though she could simply stop him by insisting on it. The hearthmark erupted. Not the gentle warmth of recognition, not the steady hum of proximity to its mate, not the white gold blaze of the curse breaking. This was the full force of it, unconstrained, unmediated, the first flame at its oldest and most absolute, a light so complete and so warm that it did not merely illuminate the darkness but argued with it, fundamentally, at the level of first principles. It poured from her palms in two streams that met and merged 2 feet in front of her into something that had no adequate word in any language she knew. Not a shield, not a weapon, a presence. The presence of warmth itself, offered outward without apology. Varel stopped. For the first time, something moved in his colorless eyes that was not professional calculation. Impossible, he said. Quietly, genuinely. The cold magic he threw at her. She felt it coming, felt the temperature drop ahead of it, dissolved. Not deflected, not absorbed. Dissolved. The way frost dissolves when a window is opened and spring air enters. The way cold dissolves when the source of it is removed. The entropy he had spent 40 years cultivating simply stopped working in the presence of what she was carrying. He threw more of it. A concentrated bolt of cold working, the kind that had imprisoned Cain for 13 months. She felt it hit the edge of her light and cease to exist. He threw more. Each time, the same. Each time, the first flame met it and the cold working ended. Not with violence but with the simple conclusiveness of one fundamental force encountering another and being found insufficient. Varel's face changed. The professional calm dissolved. What replaced it was something older and more honest. A fear that had nothing performative about it. The fear of a man who has built his entire understanding of the world's structure around a specific principle and has just watched that principle fail. "What are you?" he whispered. "I am the hearthmark," Sable said. And she stepped forward. She did not know why she stepped forward. Some instinct deeper than thought, older than choice, the same instinct that had carried her to the war hall night after night, that had raised her hands against the ice, that had pressed itself against a stone king in the dark and refused to leave him alone in the cold. The light moved with her. Varel stepped back. Then again. The darkness he had carried into the room, the deliberate, contracted darkness of a practiced sorcerer, was retreating, shrinking back from the warmth as though it had somewhere else to be. He reached for his power and found it diminished. The entropy he drew from finding no purchase in a room that was becoming, with every step she took, irreducibly warm. He was not going to survive this. She saw him understand it. Saw the calculation in his face arrive at its conclusion and find nothing useful in it. 40 years of cold practice meeting something older than cold practice had ever been, and there was no counter for it, because the counter for the first flame was the first flame's absence, and the first flame was present. He dissolved. Not dramatically, not with sound or spectacle. He simply became less substantial, the edges of him losing definition, the grey of his clothing bleeding into the grey of the retreating dark. And then there was no boundary between him and the darkness, and then the darkness pulled back toward the window, and then there was only the room. Warm, lit by the hearthmark's glow, silent. The fire in the hearth reignited. Sable stood in the center of the room with her hands still raised and her breathing the only sound in the world for a long moment. The light receded slowly back into her, the hearthmark settling to its steady hum, and she lowered her arms. Sable. She turned. Cain was on his feet. She did not know when he had gotten up. He was standing 4 feet behind her, and the expression on his face was one she had not seen yet in their short and extraordinary acquaintance. Not the iron alpha, not the controlled commander, not even the careful warmth of the man by the fire. Something stripped entirely of management. Something completely unguarded. Awe. Fierce, absolute, unqualified awe. She crossed to him. She put her hand on his chest, checking. His heartbeat was strong, his breathing even, the strain she had heard in it after the wall gone. He covered her hand with his immediately, pressing it flat against him. "You are not hurt," he said. It came out more like a demand than a question. "I am not hurt," she confirmed. He closed his eyes for a single moment. When he opened them, the awe was still there, led now with something that was relief and something else she recognized from 2 days of firelight conversations. The specific expression of a man who has confirmed something he already believed and is simultaneously gratified and shaken by the confirmation. "He could not touch you," Cain said. "No," she agreed. "You walked toward him." "Yes." He looked at her for a long moment. "Most people would not have done that." "I know." She looked down at the hearthmark, glowing soft and steady. "But the cold can't hold where the flame is. The document said so." She looked back up at him. "I believed it." Something settled in his face. Something final and irrevocable and entirely certain. The way a foundation settles when the last stone is placed. "Sable," he said, and her name in his voice had the quality it had always had, the quality of a conclusion, but deeper now, weighted now with everything the last 4 days had been. You are not the fulfillment of a prophecy. You are not the key to a curse. You are not what you are because it was written somewhere. His hand tightened over hers. You are what you are because you chose to be. Every morning in that war hall. Every hand on the ice. Every moment of 22 years that you refused, despite everything, to become small. His voice was very quiet. That is yours. That belongs to no prophecy. That is entirely you. The fire crackled warm in the hearth. Outside, Crestmore Keep was finally, after 13 months, quiet in the way of a house that has found its footing again. Not the hollow quiet of absence, but the inhabited quiet of a place where people were sleeping without fear. She looked at this man who had been stone and was now flesh, who had been alone and was now not, who had spent 13 months in the cold and who was, she understood, never going to be cold again if she had any say in it. She was discovering, considerable say. Come and sit down, she said. You hit that wall hard enough to shake the floor and you have not once acknowledged it. The almost smile arrived. Occupied its territory fully, for the first time, the complete shape of it, and it was devastating. The Iron Alpha, genuinely smiling, was a profoundly unreasonable thing to be in proximity to. I am fine, he said. You are going to sit down, she said. And I am going to make you tell me honestly how much that hurt, and you are going to do both of those things because I am apparently the Lady of Crestmore and my word carries your authority. A beat of silence. It hurt considerably, he admitted. Sit down, she said. He sat down. Chapter 9. Morning came quietly. The kind of morning that arrives without announcement, that does not announce itself in dramatic color or sudden light but simply accumulates, gray softening to pale gold at the window edges, the darkness thinning by degrees until the room is no longer dark but merely dim, and then dim becoming day so gradually that there is no single moment you could point to and say that is when it changed. Sable had not slept. She had sat by the fire through the deep hours of the night in the chair nearest the hearth, her feet tucked beneath her, the amber gold gown exchanged at some point for the simpler dark wool dress that Petra had left across the chest at the room's foot. She had sat and let the night be what it was, enormous and eventful and full of things that required sitting with before they could be properly understood. Cain had slept. This had surprised her, and then, when she considered it, had not. He had not slept in 13 months, not truly, not the restorative dark of genuine sleep, only the suspended not quite consciousness of the ice, which she understood now was not rest but a different kind of wakefulness, a dim and terrible awareness that could not act and could not cease. He had sat in the chair across from hers after Varel's dissolution, and she had made him account honestly for the wall impact. 3 bruised ribs, a conclusion she reached through the quality of his breathing and the careful way he held his left side, and which he confirmed after approximately 4 minutes of her looking at him with the specific patience of a person who is prepared to wait indefinitely. And then she had watched him fight sleep for 20 minutes through the sheer force of that found unconsciousness and unacceptable vulnerability, until his eyes had finally closed and his breathing had evened and he had slept with the absolute depth of someone who has needed to for a very long time. She had watched him for a while. She was not sure she could have explained why, except that there was something she needed to verify. Something about the reality of him, the fact of his breathing, the warm rise and fall of his chest in the firelight. She had swept around a stone man for 13 months and had felt, at the edges of it, the faint pulse of something alive inside. Seeing that aliveness fully expressed, the unconscious loosening of his face in sleep, the absence of the controlled severity, the simple animal fact of a person resting, did something to the last careful distance she was still maintaining between herself and everything the last 4 days had been. She did not try to maintain it after that. She simply sat by the fire and let it go. He woke at first light. Instantly, completely, with none of the gradual resurfacing of most people. His eyes simply opened and he was present, oriented, aware of the room and its contents and her position in it within the first breath. He looked at her across the dying fire with the silver eyes clear and steady and without the weight of the previous night's control in them. You didn't sleep, he said. I was thinking, she said. About. She looked at the hearthmark, visible above the neckline of the dark wool dress. It was quiet this morning, not the urgent burning of the war hall, not the roaring blaze of the confrontation with Varel. A warmth. A steady, inhabited warmth. The kind a hearth has when it has been burning long enough that the stones have absorbed the heat and are giving it back. About what I am, she said. What it means. What comes next. He was quiet, letting her have the sentence. My mother hid me, she continued. She kept the hearthmark covered, kept me unremarkable, kept me as far from anything that might draw attention as she could manage. She disappeared when I was 7, and I spent 15 years assuming that meant she had left. Or been taken. Or, she stopped. Looked at the fire. Varel said he found her 12 years ago. He said he thought the line was finished. A pause. She hid me well enough that he didn't know about me. And then she made sure he couldn't follow the trail back. Yes, Cain said quietly. She protected me, Sable said. With the only thing she had. Herself. The fire crackled. Outside the window, the first birds of the early morning were beginning, tentative, feeling out the air, the way birds do when the season is changing and they are not yet certain of the new rules. I have been angry at her, she said. For 22 years, I have been angry at her for leaving. For the packless years and the cold and the work and Peck and Myra Voss and every single person who looked straight through me. I have been angry at her for the hearthmark, for the strangeness of it, for the way it made me different without making me better at anything, or so I thought. She looked up. I was not abandoned. I was hidden. I was the most precious thing she had, and she hid me so carefully that not even I knew what I was. Cain looked at her steadily. She would have known about the prophecy, he said. She would have known what you were always going to be required to do. And she chose, above all the things she might have done with that knowledge, to make sure you survived long enough to do it. Yes. Sable absorbed this. Let it settle where it needed to settle. I know. She rose from the chair and crossed to the window. The courtyard below was beginning its morning, guards changing watch, the kitchen staff moving between the main building and the outbuildings with the purposeful early morning energy of people who have a great deal to do before the household wakes properly. She watched them for a moment, these people whose names she knew, whose routines she knew, whose small and daily difficulties she had been close enough to observe for 22 years. I want to do something today, she said. Tell me, Cain said, from behind her. The household staff. The full staff, kitchen, grounds, cleaning, stable. She turned from the window. I want to meet with them. Formally. As the Lady of Crestmore, in the Great Hall, before the day's other business begins. I want them to hear from me directly what has changed, what their position in this house is, what protections they have under the new administration. She paused. I want them to see me. He looked at her for a moment with the expression she was learning to read as the one he wore when she had confirmed something he had already known. That is the first thing a good lord of Crestmore should do this morning, he said. Yes. Davin should be there, she continued, working it through. And Aldous, or someone like him, someone the outer settlement workers recognize as an authority who has not been compromised. I want witnesses who mean something to the people in that room. She paused. And I want it on record. Not ceremonially, actually on record, documented, in the household administration. The protections, the process for raising a complaint, the consequences for those who abuse their position. I will have the keep scribe ready within the hour, Cain said. She nodded, still thinking. Then she looked at him directly. Did Gregor have a household charter? A formal document laying out the terms of the keep's internal governance. He did not, Cain said. I did not either, to my considerable ongoing embarrassment. Then we will make one, she said. Today, before the political meetings, before the reconstruction planning, before any of the larger things that need doing. She held his gaze. The large things are built on the small things. The pack is built on the household. If the household is sound, the pack has a foundation. The silver eyes held something warm and ungoverned in them. Where did you learn that? 22 years of watching what happens when it isn't true, she said simply. He rose from the chair. He was moving more carefully than he had the previous evening. The ribs, she noted, and filed away for later, but with the full presence of a man who had rested and was now oriented toward the work of the day. He crossed the room to her and stopped close enough that the warmth of him was present, and he looked at her with the expression she had come to understand was his most honest face. The iron alpha fully set aside. Just Cain. Just a man looking at a woman he had chosen with the complete and irrevocable conviction of someone who does not make that kind of choice often. I have governed this territory for 11 years, he said. I have managed alliances and wars and succession disputes and a dozen political crises that required the kind of decisions that keep you awake at night. A pause. In 4 days, you have already identified the single most important thing I failed to do in all of it. To be fair, she said, I had 22 years of evidence. To be fair, he returned, I had 11 years of evidence and chose not to look at it. He lifted his hand and touched the hearthmark lightly, not possessively, not with the weight of claim, but with the gentleness of a man acknowledging something he regards as sacred. That changes today. With your help. She looked down at his hand on the mark, and then up at his face. With my insistence, she said. The almost smile arrived and completed itself again, the full and devastating version, and she decided she would probably never entirely get used to it. That seemed correct. Some things should remain extraordinary. The great hall was a different room at the 7th bell of morning. No torches, no elaborate table dressings, no calculated display of power. Just the hall in its morning self. High windows throwing clean pale light across the stone floor, the tables pushed back, the space open. Sable had asked for it that way deliberately. The household staff filed in with the uncertain energy of people who have been summoned without explanation by an authority they are still determining how to read, cautious, some of them afraid, most of them carrying the wariness of people who have spent 13 months being managed by Gregor's administration and have learned that being summoned is rarely good news. She stood at the front of the hall. No dais, no elevation. Just the floor, the same floor she had swept 10,000 times, and the morning light, and the hearthmark warm at her throat. Cain stood to one side. Not beside her, to the side, and slightly back. A deliberate positioning that she had not asked for but that she understood when she saw it. Present, available, but not the center of the moment. Supporting rather than leading. Davin beside him with the same understanding in his careful face. She recognized every person in the room. Every name, every face, every particular story. Fen from the kitchens who had a child with a persistent cough and had been asking Peck for 3 months to allow her a day to take him to the settlement healer. Old Marsh from the stables whose hands had gotten bad enough with the cold that he could barely manage the buckles on the winter bridles. Young Liz who cleaned the upper corridor and had been wearing the same pair of shoes since spring because no one had authorized the household allocation for new ones. She knew all of it. She had been invisible in all their midst for 22 years and she had paid attention. She looked out at them now and waited for the room to settle. My name is Sable, she said, when it had. Some of you know me. Most of you know me as the packless girl on the floor staff. A pause, letting the acknowledgement land. I am the Lady of Crestmore. I carry the hearthmark of the first flame bloodline, and I am Lord Aldric's mate. She did not perform this, did not announce it with ceremony or portent. She said it the way she said most true things, plainly, and with the confidence of someone who has examined the fact from every angle and found it sound. I am telling you this not because it changes what I know about this household or what I intend to do about it. I am telling you this so you understand that the person making the following commitments has the full authority of the Aldric seat behind them. She could feel the quality of attention in the room shift. Not from indifference. They had been attentive from the beginning, because summoned staff are always attentive, but to something more specific, more alive. Effective this morning, she continued, Crestmore Keep operates under a household charter. It will be read aloud when it is drafted, later today, and a copy will be posted in the staff corridor, the kitchen, and the stables. The charter establishes the following. She looked across the assembled faces. Every person employed in this household is entitled to adequate food, adequate clothing for the season, and adequate rest. These are not allowances given at a steward's discretion. They are entitlements. Baseline. Not negotiable. The room was very quiet. Every person in this household has the right to bring a complaint to a designated household advocate, a position we will establish today, without fear of retaliation. Complaints will be heard, recorded, and acted upon. She paused. If you have been waiting to tell someone about something that has been wrong in this household, you will have that opportunity. Formally. On record. Today. Fen from the kitchens had gone very still. The conduct that characterized this household under the previous administration, the use of physical force against staff, the arbitrary withholding of allocation, the assignment of punishment duties without documented cause, that conduct is finished. If it recurs under the new administration, it will be treated as a violation of the charter and addressed accordingly. She looked at them steadily. I want to be clear about why I am telling you this. Not because it is politically useful for the Lady of Crestmore to appear to care about her staff. Because I have slept in your dormitory. I have eaten at your table. I have worked your hours and worn your shoes, and I know exactly what this household has cost the people in it. A pause. You deserve better. You always deserved better. I am sorry it took this long. The silence in the hall had a texture now, layered and complex, made of relief and disbelief and the careful evaluation of whether this was real. And beneath all of it something beginning to warm, the way a room warms when the fire finally catches. Old Marsh went to one knee. He did it slowly, with the careful movements of a man whose joints did not cooperate fully, and he did it looking at her, not at the floor, not at the alpha behind her, but at her directly, with an expression of uncomplicated dignity. My lady, he said. Fen went to her knees. Then Liz. Then the rest of them, one by one and in small groups, the sound of it a quiet percussion across the stone floor, and it was nothing like the court kneeling in the great hall the previous evening. That had been political calculus, the rapid adjustment of ambitious people to a new power arrangement. This was something else. This was people kneeling to someone they had decided, in the space of 5 minutes, to trust. Sable stood in the morning light on the floor she had swept 10,000 times and felt the full, impossible weight of it. And this time she did not need a year to believe it. She looked to her left. Cain was watching her with the unguarded face, the complete face, the one with nothing managed in it. When her eyes found his, he gave a single, small nod. Not the nod of a lord approving a subordinate's performance. The nod of a person acknowledging a person. You, it said. Exactly you. All along, exactly you. She turned back to the hall. Rise, she said. We have work to do. The day that followed was the kind of day that does not feel like a single day from inside it. The household charter was drafted by mid-morning, Cain's scribe working at a pace that suggested he had been told to consider it the most important document he had produced in his career, which Sable suspected was accurate. She reviewed every clause personally, revised 2 of them, added a third that Cain read over her shoulder and then said yes to in the voice of a man who has noticed he should have thought of that himself. Fenn's son was authorized to see the settlement healer that afternoon. Marsh's winter bridal allocation was released from the household stores before noon. Liz was measured for new shoes by the keep's cobbler by the time the midday bell rang. These were small things. They were not the reconstruction of the outer settlement economies, not the renegotiation of the alliance structures that Gregor had damaged, not the long and complex work of restoring ironholds standing among the packed territories. Those things would take months, and some of them would take years, and Cain was already 3 hours into the first of the political meetings that would begin to address them. But Sable had learned, across 22 years of being a small thing in a large household, that the small things were not small. They were the temperature of a place. They were the difference between a household that feared its walls and a household that trusted them. She spent the afternoon walking the keep. Not inspecting it. She knew every inch of it already. Walking it as what she was now, as the Lady of Crestmore, feeling the difference in how the rooms received her, in how the staff moved when she was present, in the quality of the air in corridors that had been cold for 13 months and were beginning, cautiously, to warm. She stopped in the war hall last. The dais was empty. The stone bare where the ice had been, the floor around it still bearing the faint residue of steam in its grain. She could see it when the afternoon light caught it at the right angle, the ghost of where the ice had been, the record of its ending. She stood at the foot of the dais and looked at the empty space where she had swept every morning for over a year, where she had pressed her hand against the cold and felt the faint ember of a pulse, where she had stood in the dark before dawn and understood, without having the words for it yet, that she was not going to leave him alone in the cold. She had not known, then, that he could feel it. She had come because she could not come. Because the pull was there every morning and because something in her had decided, at some point she could not precisely identify, that the man in the ice deserved to know that someone was there. That was all. Not prophecy, not power, not the hearthmark's compulsion. Just a girl with nothing to offer choosing to offer the one thing she had. Presence. Warmth. The refusal to let the cold have the last word. She pressed her hand flat against the empty stone of the dais. It was warm. The ice was gone, and the stone had taken its natural temperature again, and the warmth in it was the warmth of a building that had a fire burning in its heart again. The warmth of a place that was inhabited. She stood there for a moment, her hand on the stone, and felt the hearthmark pulse once, warm and steady in content. Not urgent. Not reaching towards something absent. Simply present. At home. I thought I would find you here. She turned. Cain stood in the doorway, still in his working clothes, The day's meetings apparently concluded, a faint tiredness around his eyes that he was managing with his customary efficiency. He looked at her hand on the dais stone and then at her face, and something moved through his expression. He crossed the hall and stopped beside her, and he put his own hand on the stone beside hers, and they stood together on the cold floor of the war hall in the late afternoon light. "The Outer Settlement Packmaster requests a formal meeting within the week," he said, after a moment. "Good," she said. 3 of the allied Alpha houses have sent riders requesting audience. 2 of them are genuine alliance inquiries. 1 of them is Gregor's old coalition, feeling out whether contrition is available. "What did you tell them?" "I told them the Lady of Crestmore would determine the agenda for those discussions." A pause. "I hope that was acceptable." She looked at him. He was looking at the empty dais with the expression of a man in the presence of something enormous that he is choosing to hold lightly. "More than acceptable," she said. He turned to look at her, and the silver eyes were very direct and very warm, and she had stopped, somewhere in the last 4 days, being surprised by what she found in them. "The scribe has a document waiting for your signature," he said. "The household charter. It requires both our names." "Both," she said. "Both," he confirmed. "The charter of Crestmore Keep is issued under the joint authority of the Lord and the Lady of the Seat. I had him write it that way from the beginning." He held her gaze steadily. "I want there to be no ambiguity about where this household's governance lies." She thought about Myra's voice in this hall. "He does not know you are alive." And about every morning she had stood on this floor and swept around a frozen king and felt the absurd, impractical conviction that he was still in there. She thought about the warmth that had poured from her hands on the night the ice broke, and about the first time he had said her name, and about a fire built in a solar and 2 days of honest conversation, and about an old sorcerer dissolving in the light of something older than cold. She thought about her mother, who had hidden her so well that she had spent 22 years not knowing who she was, and who had done it out of love, and who she would find the truth of, in time, with the resources she now had available. She thought about all of it, and then she simply stood in the present moment, in the war hall, with her hand on warm stone and the hearthmark steady at her throat and Cain Aldric beside her, and she felt the full shape of what her life had become. "Then let us go sign it," she said. "We have a keep to run." He offered her his arm. She took it. They walked out of the war hall together, and behind them the empty dais caught the last of the afternoon light, and the war hall was warm, and the cold was gone, and it did not come back. Chapter 10. 6 months is not a long time to rebuild a kingdom. It is, however, long enough to know whether the rebuilding is real. Sable had learned this the way she learned most things, not from a book or a lesson or a formal transfer of knowledge, but from the accumulating evidence of daily life in a place that was changing. From the quality of the morning sounds in the keep, which had shifted from the careful quiet of a household walking on the edges of itself to something more natural, more inhabited. The sound of people moving through a space that belonged to them. From the faces in the corridor when she passed, which had stopped performing and started simply being. From Fenn's son, whose cough had cleared entirely by the 3rd week of winter, and who now ran errands through the keep with the uninhibited velocity of a child who had not yet learned that the world required caution. These were not the metrics that appeared in the reconstruction reports Aldous presented at the weekly council table. Those reports tracked the outer settlement tax adjustments, the rebuilding of depleted stores, the careful renegotiation of the alliance agreements that Gregor had leveraged and weakened. They tracked pack morale indices and border security assessments and the slow, forensic work of tracing the resources Gregor had redirected and returning them to their correct destinations. They were important documents, thorough and necessary, and Sable read every page of every one of them. But the metric she trusted most was simpler. She listened for the laughter. Crestmore Keep laughed again. In the kitchens, in the stable yard, in the staff corridors in the hour after the evening duties were done. Not forced laughter, not the performed conviviality of people trying to demonstrate that they were not afraid. Actual laughter, the spontaneous, unmanaged kind that happens in spaces where people feel safe enough to be surprised by something funny. It had taken 3 weeks to arrive. She had been listening for it from the beginning, and when she first heard it, 2 of the kitchen girls dissolving into helpless giggles over something she was too far away to catch, in the corridor outside the great hall, at the 7th bell of morning, she had stopped walking and simply stood there and let the sound be what it was. Cain had found her there. He had looked at her face and then in the direction she was listening and then back at her face, and he had understood without explanation, and he had stood beside her in the corridor and listened with her for a moment before they continued on their way. He had not said anything. He did not need to. That was 6 months ago, and the laughter had not stopped. The winter had been hard in the particular way of northern winters. Not cruel, just thorough, the kind of cold that meant business and expected to be taken seriously. Sable had learned that winter at Crestmore from the inside rather than the edges, which was an entirely different education. She had spent previous winters calculating how to stay warm enough to function on an allocation that did not quite cover the cost of it. This winter she had spent in the rooms that had a fire and the clothing that was adequate and the meals that were sufficient, and she had used the difference, the time and energy that had previously gone into managing deprivation, to work. There was no shortage of work. The household charter had been the beginning. From it, 3 specific structural changes to the keep's internal governance had been identified, drafted, and implemented in the first month: a formal household advocate position, filled by a steady woman from the ground staff named Wren who had the combination of fairness and backbone the role required, a quarterly review process for all household allocations, and a documented complaints procedure that had, in 6 months, received 14 formal submissions and resolved 13 of them to the satisfaction of the person who had submitted it. The 14th was ongoing. Sable reviewed it herself each week. Beyond the household, there was the broader work of the territory. She had not taken Cain's political responsibilities from him. She had no interest in that kind of acquisition, and he had no interest in surrendering it. What she had done was become the thing that the political work had never previously had: a counterweight. A voice in the council room that asked different questions, weighted different considerations, prioritized things that did not appear in the war chest tallies or the alliance assessments but were nonetheless real. What are the conditions in the outer settlements for people who are not pack members? She had asked, in the 3rd council meeting, and the silence that followed had been informative. How does the pack's formal grievance process account for people who cannot afford to petition it? She had asked in the 5th, and Aldous had looked at her with the expression of a man who has spent decades in pack governance and has just been asked a question he should have asked himself years ago. The answers to those questions were now being addressed. Slowly, with the careful pace of institutional change, but genuinely. Cain had said, after the 7th council meeting, "You are making me a better lord." "You were already a good lord," she had said. "I am making you a complete one." He had looked at her with the unguarded face and said nothing, which meant he agreed entirely. Spring arrived the way spring always arrived in the north, tentatively, 1 degree at a time, testing the air before committing to it. The first green appeared in the kitchen garden in the 2nd week of the 3rd month, and Sable was there when it did, because she had been tending the medicinal herb beds through the winter with the careful attention of someone who understood that the hearthmark's power was a power of life, and that working with living things was not incidental to it but continuous with it. She had discovered this gradually, across the 6 months, in the same way she had discovered everything about the hearthmark, not through instruction but through attention. The mark responded to growing things. When she worked in the garden, it hummed with the same steady warmth it held in Cain's presence, as though the act of tending was itself a practice of the power, a small and daily exercise of what she was. She had coaxed the medicinal beds through the winter with more success than the keep's previous gardeners had managed in years, and the settlement healer who collected from them in the spring had looked at the yield with an expression of such transparent gratitude that Sable had made a note to expand the beds in the coming season. She was kneeling in the first green of spring, her hands in the cold earth, when she heard footsteps she recognized at 30 yards. "The Northern Packmaster's delegation has arrived," Cain said, crouching beside her with the easy movement of a man whose ribs had been fully healed for 5 months. He looked at the small green spears emerging from the soil with the expression he reserved for things he found genuinely interesting but would not know how to categorize. "They are 40 minutes early. They are anxious to demonstrate enthusiasm," she said, brushing the soil from her hands. "Let them wait 20 minutes. Not to make a point, just long enough for them to feel that they have arrived rather than ambushed us." He looked at her sideways. 40 minutes early is ambitious. They have been waiting 6 months for formal recognition. 40 minutes of anticipation is a courtesy compared to the wait. She sat back on her heels and looked at the green garden in the pale spring light. "Give them tea in the sitting room with the eastern windows. Make sure Davin is the one who greets them. They respect him. And you?" 20 minutes, she said, "and then I will be there." He remained crouching beside her for a moment, looking at the garden, and she could feel the quality of his presence, that particular warm gravity that she had stopped noticing in the way you stop noticing a thing that has become part of the texture of your life, and then occasionally noticed again with a shock of recognition and gratitude. "You have soil on your face," he said. "I am aware," she said. He reached out and removed it with his thumb, a gesture so natural and so gentle that it was over before she had fully registered it, and she looked at him in the spring light, this severe and extraordinary man who had been stone and was now simply hers, who governed a territory with an iron hand and removed soil from her cheek with a careful thumb, who had spent 13 months alone in the cold and was never, she had decided, going to be cold again if she could prevent it. "What?" he said, reading her face. "Nothing," she said. "Everything." He understood both. She could see it in the silver eyes. The delegation meeting lasted 3 hours and concluded with a formal agreement that Sable and Cain signed together, side by side at the council table, which she had made a point of ensuring was the standard from the beginning. Not a ceremony, a practice. The routine normalization of a shared authority, repeated until it required no explanation. The Northern Packmaster, Aldric's counterpart, a broad woman named Kira with 20 years of settlement governance and the direct manner of someone who had no patience for anything that wasn't useful, had looked at Sable across the table in the first 10 minutes with the frank assessment of a practical person determining whether a new variable was worth accounting for. She had apparently arrived at yes by the end of the first hour. The quality of her engagement had shifted, and the questions she directed at Sable had acquired the specificity of someone consulting a genuine authority rather than performing courtesy to a lord's consort. After the signing, when the delegation was being seen to their guest chambers, Kira had paused in the doorway and looked back at Sable with an expression that was not quite a smile. It was too pragmatic for that, but held the warmth of one. "The outer settlements have been talking about you," she said. "About what you changed in the household. About the charter." She paused. "People like knowing that the person at the top remembers what the bottom looks like." "I remember it very clearly," Sable said. Kira nodded once, the nod of a woman filing a confirmed fact, and left. Cain appeared at Sable's shoulder. She had not heard him approach, which she had stopped being surprised by. "Well," he said. "She will be a good ally," Sable said. "She is honest and she is practical and she does not want things she cannot justify. Those are the best kind." "Agreed." A pause. "Davin says the evening meal is ready." "Then let us eat," she said. They ate in the solar. Not because the great hall was unavailable, it was perfectly available, and they used it for formal occasions with the regularity the territory required. But the solar was theirs, and had been theirs since the beginning, and there was a specific quality to an evening in it that the great hall, for all its restored warmth and legitimate beauty, did not replicate. The fireplace, the bookshelves, the desk with its maps, the 2 chairs facing the hearth at the angle they had arrived at over 6 months of sitting in them, which was not quite the angle they had originally been placed at but was now correct, the angle of chairs that have been adjusted by use. They ate and talked about the delegation, and then about the spring planting schedules that Sable had been reviewing with the settlement agricultural advisors, and then about a piece of intelligence Davin had received that morning regarding a minor territorial dispute in the Eastern Reach that would require attention in the coming weeks. Then the conversation ran out, the way conversations run out in the evenings, and they sat with the comfortable silence of 2 people who had learned that silence was not a gap to be filled but a texture to be inhabited. The fire settled. The candles on the desk threw their light across the spines of the books and the corners of the maps and the small, accumulating evidence of a life being lived. A teacup, a document with notes in 2 different hands in the margins, a sprig of early herb from the kitchen garden that Sable had brought in that morning and set in a glass of water on the windowsill. "I have been thinking," Cain said. She waited. "About what I was before the curse." He was looking at the fire, his forearms on his knees, his face in the unguarded position it held in private. "I have told you I was hard, cold, that I governed through strength and did not pay sufficient attention to the things strength cannot address." A pause. "I have been thinking about whether I was unhappy." She was quiet, listening. "I was not unhappy in the way I understand unhappiness now," he said. "I had no reference point for what was missing. I had the territory and the responsibility and the work, and those things were enough, because I did not know what enough actually felt like." He looked at her. "I know now." "What does it feel like?" she asked. He considered this with the seriousness he brought to everything that mattered. "Like the fire is real," he said finally. Like the warmth in a room is not a resource being managed but simply warmth. Present, not contingent. He held her gaze. Like waking up and knowing that the day has a fixed point in it that does not depend on whether the work goes well or the council agrees or the territory is stable. A point that is simply there. She looked at him across the fire. "You are describing me," she said softly. "Yes," he said. "Cain." "Yes." "I love you," she said. She had not planned it. It arrived the way the important things had always arrived for her. Not deliberated, not managed, simply present and true and requiring no preparation because it had been true for long enough that saying it was not a beginning but an acknowledgement. He went very still. Then he crossed the space between their chairs, stood before her and reached down and took both her hands in his and drew her to her feet, and looked at her in the firelight with the silver eyes holding everything they had ever held and something beyond all of it. Something that had no prior name because it had not existed before this. "Sable," he said. His voice was very quiet. "From the morning I woke and you were the first thing I breathed, you have been the fixed point. You have been the warmth in every room. You have been the thing that made the work worth the weight of it and the days worth the difficulty of them." He held her hands with the same careful strength he brought to everything. Fully present, fully committed, nothing held back. "I have governed this territory for 11 years and I have never in all of them been as certain of anything as I am of you." A pause. "I love you. I have loved you since before I knew what you were, because what you are was present in the warmth I felt through the ice every morning, and some part of me that predates language knew it then." The fire crackled. Outside the solar window, the spring night was clear and cold and full of stars, and the sounds of Crestmore Keep settling into its evening were the sounds of a place that was well, that was tended, that was home. She leaned forward and kissed him. Not the first time. Not by many counts. But each time had its own quality, and this one had the quality of a thing that had arrived at its full expression. Not the desperate relief of the first real kiss. Not the declarative passion of the public hall. But something settled and deep and quietly exhilarating. The kiss of two people who have chosen each other past the point of ceremony and are still choosing each other, right now, in an ordinary evening by an ordinary fire. Which was the best and truest kind of choosing. When they parted he pressed his forehead against hers, and they stood in the firelight in the room that had become theirs, and she felt the hearthmark warm and steady at her throat, not urgent, not blazing, not reaching towards something absent. Present. Home. Complete. This is what they would say about her, in the years and decades that followed. That she had been nobody, packless, shiftless, invisible in the margins of a great house, and had become the lady of it. That she had broken a 13-month ice curse with her bare hands and a birthmark her mother had given her a name for. That she had faced a 40-year sorcerer alone in a dark room and had not run. That she had stood in the great hall of Crestmore Keep in a flame-colored gown and spoken with an authority that no one had given her and no one, after that night, would ever think to question. They would say she had been the prophecy's fulfillment, the hearthmark child, the first flame's heir, the mate of the Iron Alpha. All of that was true. But the people of Crestmore Keep, the ones who had swept its floors and tended its gardens and carried its trays through its long cold corridors, they told a different version. They told it to their children, and their children told it to theirs, and in that version the prophecy was not the point. In that version, a girl with nothing, no wolf, no pack, no family name, no armor against a world that had decided she was worth nothing, had chosen, every single morning, to press her hand against the cold and refuse to leave the imprisoned king alone in it. Not because she knew what she was. Not because the prophecy had told her to. Because she had looked at something trapped and alone and had decided, with the only resources she had, that she would not walk past it. That was the story they told. That the power had always been there, yes. That the destiny had been real, yes. But that neither of those things had mattered until a girl with cold feet and a covered birthmark and 22 years of being invisible had made a small and daily choice to show up. That was what the hearthmark was, in the end. Not a weapon. Not a key. Not a fulfillment of ancient law. A warmth, offered outward. The refusal to let the cold be the last word. The most ordinary kind of power, and the most irresistible. On a morning in late spring, 6 months and 11 days after the ice broke, Sable stood in the kitchen garden of Crestmore Keep with her hands in the warm earth and the hearthmark glowing softly at her throat and the sound of Cain's voice somewhere in the inner courtyard, speaking with Davin about the day's schedule in the unhurried tone of a man who has slept well and knows what the day contains and is not afraid of any of it. She pressed her palms flat against the soil. It was warm. The ground had fully thawed, the winter's cold relinquished, the earth ready for the season's new work. She felt the life in it, the green energy, the patience of growing things, the deep and inexhaustible willingness of the living world to begin again. The hearthmark answered it. Warmth meeting warmth. Life recognizing life. She thought about a girl who had swept floors in the cold and felt sorry for a stone king. She thought about her mother, who had hidden her with love so careful it had looked, for 22 years, like absence. She thought about everything the next season would require. The outer settlement work, the eastern dispute, the ongoing careful labor of rebuilding a territory and a household and 1,000 small dignities that had been taken from people who deserved them. She thought about Cain, who was in the courtyard right now, and who she would see in approximately 10 minutes, and who she would spend the day beside, and the next day, and the days beyond that, in the ordinary and extraordinary continuing work of a shared life. She thought about all of it, and then she simply stopped thinking and was present, in the spring morning, in the warm earth, in the body that carried the first flame, in the keep that was finally, genuinely, completely home. The hearthmark hummed, warm, steady, unafraid of the cold.